Picture a grand seaside hotel in 1925, Cornwall, where the waves whisper secrets and trust hides betrayal. When wealthy widow Lydia Ashford drowns under mysterious circumstances, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle smile, unravels. A chilling plot, a devoted companion, a hidden past, a staged death, every glance conceals a lie. As clues weave together, Marple exposes a murderer's desperate bid for fortune, proving no secret escapes her quiet gaze. Dive into The Companion, where human hearts unravel in a deadly dance of envy and deception. Chapter 1. The Arrival at St. Morwenna's Bather. Late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the Cornish countryside as the train chugged towards St. Morwenna's Bay. Inside the carriage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her small, neat figure wrapped in a tweed coat, her hands folded over a worn leather handbag. At 72, her pink cheeks and delicate frame suggested fragility, but her clear blue eyes, darting from the passing hedgerows to her fellow passengers, missed nothing. She was bound for a holiday at the Cliffside Hotel, a suggestion from her nephew Raymond, who insisted the sea air would do her good. A quiet place, Aunt Jane, he had written, perfect for rest. Yet, as the train slowed, a faint prickle of intuition stirred within her, as if the salt breeze carried secrets. The platform at St. Morwenna's Bay was a modest affair, bustling with porters and holidaymakers. Miss Marple stepped down, her sensible shoes clicking on the stone, and adjusted her lace gloves. A young man from the hotel, his cap askew, took her modest suitcase, and she followed him to a waiting car. The drive wound along cliffs, where gulls wheeled above waves that churned against jagged rocks. The Cliffside Hotel loomed ahead, a Victorian edifice of red brick and white trim, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. Ivy clung to its walls, lending an air of faded grandeur at the entrance. Mrs. Enid Carstairs, the hotel manager, greeted her with practiced warmth. A woman in her late 40s, Enid's auburn hair was pinned tightly, and her smile strained at the edges. "Miss Marple, such a pleasure," she said, her voice a touch too bright. "We've reserved a charming room for you, with a view of the bay." Her hands fluttered, betraying a nervous energy. Miss Marple inclined her head graciously, noting the woman's unease. "How kind," she murmured, her tone gentle but her mind cataloguing the detail. The lobby was a study in elegance, polished oak paneling, chandeliers casting soft light, and a grand staircase curving upward. Guests milled about, their voices a low hum. Miss Marple's room on the second floor was as promised, with a wide window framing the turquoise expanse of the bay. She unpacked her few belongings, a shawl, her knitting, a well-thumbed copy of The Vicar of Wakefield, and paused to study the scene below. Fishing boats bobbed in the distance, and a crescent of sandy beach curved toward rocky outcrops. It was idyllic, yet something in the air felt off, like a note played slightly out of tune. That evening, Miss Marple descended to the lounge for tea, her black dress offset by a single pearl brooch. The room buzzed with conversation, and she settled in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly. From this vantage point, she observed the other guests. Dr. Hugh Langley, a retired physician with a weathered face and kind eyes, discussed the weather with a waiter. Miss Clara Vernon, a painter whose vibrant scarves clashed with her loud laugh, gestured animatedly to a group of young men. But Miss Marple's attention fixed on two women seated by a window, Mrs. Lydia Ashford and her companion, Miss Evelyn Crane. Lydia Ashford, a widow in her mid-50s, wore an elegant silk dress, but her posture was tense, her thin fingers twisting. A handkerchief, her face, though handsome, bore lines of strain, and her eyes flickered nervously toward the sea. Evelyn Crane, perhaps 30, was her opposite poised, with sleek dark hair and a smile that seemed to charm effortlessly. She leaned toward Lydia, murmuring something, her hand resting lightly on the older woman's arm. The gesture appeared solicitous, yet Miss Marple noted a certain deliberation in it, as if Evelyn were playing a part. Mrs. Carstairs paused by Miss Marple's chair, offering a plate of scones. "Mrs. Ashford and her companion are regulars," she confided, lowering her voice. "Miss Crane is so devoted, always at her side." Miss Marple smiled politely. "How fortunate for Mrs. Ashford," she said, but her thoughts lingered on. Evelyn's polished demeanour. In her experience, such perfection often masked something else entirely. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her needles moving rhythmically. A young couple danced to a gramophone's tune, and Dr. Langley joined Clara Vernon in a debate about art. Lydia and Evelyn retired early, Evelyn guiding Lydia with a hand under her elbow. Miss Marple watched them go, her mind sifting through impressions. She thought of her village, St. Mary Mead, where human nature revealed itself in small, telling ways: a glance, a hesitation, a too careful word. St. Morwenna's Bay was new, but people, she knew, were much the same. Retiring to her room, she stood by the window, the sea now a dark expanse under a crescent moon. A faint unease lingered, not yet a suspicion, but a whisper of something amiss. She smoothed her shawl and turned to her knitting, trusting that, in time, the pattern would reveal itself. Chapter 2. The incident on the beach. The morning sun bathed St. Morwenna's Bay in a golden glow, its rays dancing on the waves that lapped the crescent of sandy beach below the cliffside hotel. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, had taken her breakfast in the dining room, a modest meal of toast, marmalade, and tea for making her way to the shore. She wore a sensible straw hat, its brim shielding her sharp blue eyes, and carried a canvas bag containing her knitting, a small notebook, and a pair of binoculars she claimed were for birdwatching. Settling under a striped parasol, she arranged her shawl over her knees and began to knit, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying the seaside, but her gaze swept the beach with quiet purpose, noting every detail. The beach was lively with hotel guests and locals. Children scampered near the tide, their laughter mingling with the cries of gulls. A group of young men played cricket on the sand, their shouts punctuated by the thwack of bat on ball. Dr. Hugh Langley, the retired physician, strolled along the water's edge, pausing to examine a piece of driftwood. Miss Clara Vernon, the painter, had set up an easel near the rocks, her brush darting across a canvas as she captured the sea's shifting hues. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Clara's flamboyant scarf, a splash of crimson against the muted tones of her smock, and made a mental note of the woman's expressive gestures. Her attention shifted to Mrs. Lydia Ashford and her companion, Miss Evelyn Crane, who emerged from the hotel's cliffside path. Lydia, wrapped in a heavy shawl despite the warmth, moved with a hesitant gait, her face pale and drawn. Evelyn, by contrast, was a vision of vitality in a bright yellow sundress, her dark hair catching the sunlight. She guided Lydia to a deck near the water, arranging a blanket over her lap with practiced care. "There, now you'll feel better with some fresh air," Evelyn said, her voice carrying a cheerful lilt. Lydia nodded faintly, her fingers clutching the shore's edge. Miss Marple, knitting steadily, observed the exchange. Evelyn's solicitude seemed genuine, yet there was a precision to her movements, a touch too deliberate, like an actress mindful of her audience. Evelyn soon left Lydia's side to join Dr. Langley, who was now inspecting a cluster of shells. Their conversation appeared animated, Evelyn's laughter ringing out as she tossed her head. Lydia, alone in her chair, stared at the sea, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. She recalled Lydia's nervous demeanour in the lounge the previous evening, the way her eyes had darted toward Evelyn as if seeking reassurance or watching for something else. The dynamic between the two women intrigued her, stirring a faint echo of cases past, where devotion masked darker, intense. The morning progressed, the beach growing busier. Mrs. Enid Carstairs, the hotel manager, appeared briefly, her auburn hair pinned tightly as she conferred with a waiter distributing lemonade. She cast a glance toward Lydia, her brow creasing, before hurrying back to the hotel. Miss Marple noted the manager's unease, filing it away alongside other observations. A young couple, honeymooners by their clinging hands, splashed in the shallows, while a local fisherman mended nets near the rocks, his weathered face impassive. At 11:30, Miss Marple adjusted her position to better view the rocky outcrop. At the beach's northern end, the tide was low, exposing pools teeming with crabs and anemones. Clara Vernon had moved her easel closer to the rocks, her brushstrokes growing more fervent. Evelyn, now back at Lydia's side, was urging her to take a sip of water. "You mustn't let yourself get too warm," she said, her tone coaxing. Lydia complied, but her hand trembled, spilling a few drops. Miss Marple's lips pursed. She had seen tremors like that before, in villagers gripped by fear or illness. The question was, which dot the clock in the village church struck noon, its chimes faint over the waves. Miss Marple reached for her binoculars, ostensibly to study a tern gliding overhead, but her gaze swept the beach. Evelyn had wandered toward the rocks, her yellow dress a bright spot against the grey stone. Lydia remained in her chair, her shawl slipping to reveal a thin arm. Miss Marple was about to resume knitting when a piercing scream shattered the air. The sound came from Clara Vernon, who stood ankle-deep in a tidal pool, her hand pointing toward the water. "There, look," she cried, her voice shrill. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the beach. Miss Marple's binoculars snapped to the spot, revealing a figure floating face down in the shallows, not 20 yards from the rocks. The body bobbed gently, its limbs splayed, a shawl trailing like seaweed. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Dr. Langley was the first to act, splashing into the water with surprising agility for a man of his years. 2 young cricketers followed, their bats abandoned. Together they dragged the figure to shore. Laying it on the sand, a murmur of recognition swept through the onlookers. It was Lydia Ashford, her face ashen, her silk dress clinging to her frail form. Dr. Langley knelt beside her, pressing his fingers to her wrist, then her neck. His movements were swift but methodical, his expression grim. He began chest compressions, water pooling beneath Lydia's body, but after several minutes he sat back, shaking his head. "She's gone," he said, his voice low. "Drowned, I'm afraid." A sob broke the silence. Evelyn Crane, who had rushed back from the rocks, fell to her knees beside Lydia, her hands covering her face. "No, oh no," she moaned, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple, standing now, observed the scene from a distance. Evelyn's grief was convincing, her cries drawing sympathetic glances, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The companion's hands, pressed to her cheeks, were dry, and her sobs lacked the ragged edge of true despair. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow who had wept similarly at her husband's funeral, only to be found later with a lover and a forged will. The crowd parted as Inspector Arthur Treglis arrived, summoned from the village station. A stocky man with a weathered face and keen grey eyes, he exuded quiet authority. His constable, a lanky youth named Pierce, trailed behind, notebook in hand. Treglis surveyed the scene, his gaze lingering on Lydia's body, then moving to Dr. Langley. "What happened here, doctor?" he asked, his Cornish accent soft but firm. Langley rose, brushing sand from his trousers, found her in the water, floating near the rocks. No pulse when we pulled her out. I tried to revive her, but... He trailed off, his brow furrowed. Treglis nodded, turning to the crowd. Did anyone see her go in? Heads shook, and murmurs of denial followed. Clara Vernon, still pale, stepped forward. "I was painting by the rocks. I didn't see her until she was there, in the water." Her voice trembled, and she clutched her scarf. Chapter 2. The incident on the beach. The morning sun bathed St. Morwenna's Bay in a golden glow, its rays dancing on the waves that lapped the crescent of sandy beach below the cliffside hotel. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, had taken her breakfast in the dining room, a modest meal of toast, marmalade, and tea for making her way to the shore. She wore a sensible straw hat, its brim shielding her sharp blue eyes, and carried a canvas bag containing her knitting, a small notebook, and a pair of binoculars she claimed were for bird watching. Settling under a striped parasol, she arranged her shawl over her knees and began to knit, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying the seaside, but her gaze swept the beach with quiet purpose, noting every detail. The beach was lively with hotel guests and locals. Children scampered near the tide, their laughter mingling with the cries of gulls. A group of young men played cricket on the sand, their shouts punctuated by the thwack of bat on ball. Dr. Hugh Langley, the retired physician, strolled along the water's edge, pausing to examine a piece of driftwood. Miss Clara Vernon, the painter, had set up an easel near the rocks, her brush darting across a canvas as she captured the sea's shifting hues. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Clara's flamboyant scarf, a splash of crimson against the muted tones of her smock, and made a mental note of the woman's expressive gestures. Her attention shifted to Mrs. Lydia Ashford and her companion, Miss Evelyn Crane, who emerged from the hotel's cliffside path. Lydia, wrapped in a heavy shawl despite the warmth, moved with a hesitant gait, her face pale and drawn. Evelyn, by contrast, was a vision of vitality in a bright yellow sundress, her dark hair catching the sunlight. She guided Lydia to a deck near the water, arranging a blanket over her lap with practiced care. "There, now you'll feel better with some fresh air," Evelyn said, her voice carrying a cheerful lilt. Lydia nodded faintly, her fingers clutching the shore's edge. Miss Marple, knitting steadily, observed the exchange. Evelyn's solicitude seemed genuine, yet there was a precision to her movements, a touch too deliberate, like an actress mindful of her audience. Evelyn soon left Lydia's side to join Dr. Langley, who was now inspecting a cluster of shells. Their conversation appeared animated, Evelyn's laughter ringing out as she tossed her head. Lydia, alone in her chair, stared at the sea, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. She recalled Lydia's nervous demeanour in the lounge the previous evening, the way her eyes had darted toward Evelyn as if seeking reassurance or watching for something else. The dynamic between the two women intrigued her, stirring a faint echo of cases past, where devotion masked darker, intense. The morning progressed, the beach growing busier. Mrs. Enid Carstairs, the hotel manager, appeared briefly, her auburn hair pinned tightly as she conferred with a waiter distributing lemonade. She cast a glance toward Lydia, her brow creasing, before hurrying back to the hotel. Miss Marple noted the manager's unease, filing it away alongside other observations. A young couple, honeymooners by their clinging hands, splashed in the shallows, while a local fisherman mended nets near the rocks, his weathered face impassive. At 11:30, Miss Marple adjusted her position to better view the rocky outcrop. At the beach's northern end, the tide was low, exposing pools teeming with crabs and anemones. Clara Vernon had moved her easel closer to the rocks, her brushstrokes growing more fervent. Evelyn, now back at Lydia's side, was urging her to take a sip of water. "You mustn't let yourself get too warm," she said, her tone coaxing. Lydia complied, but her hand trembled, spilling a few drops. Miss Marple's lips pursed. She had seen tremors like that before, in villagers gripped by fear or illness. The question was, which dot the clock in the village church struck noon, its chimes faint over the waves. Miss Marple reached for her binoculars, ostensibly to study a tern gliding overhead, but her gaze swept the beach. Evelyn had wandered toward the rocks, her yellow dress a bright spot against the grey stone. Lydia remained in her chair, her shawl slipping to reveal a thin arm. Miss Marple was about to resume knitting when a piercing scream shattered the air. The sound came from Clara Vernon, who stood ankle-deep in a tidal pool, her hand pointing toward the water. "There, look," she cried, her voice shrill. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the beach. Miss Marple's binoculars snapped to the spot, revealing a figure floating face down in the shallows, not 20 yards from the rocks. The body bobbed gently, its limbs splayed, a shawl trailing like seaweed. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Dr. Langley was the first to act, splashing into the water with surprising agility for a man of his years. 2 young cricketers followed, their bats abandoned. Together they dragged the figure to shore. Laying it on the sand, a murmur of recognition swept through the onlookers. It was Lydia Ashford, her face ashen, her silk dress clinging to her frail form. Dr. Langley knelt beside her, pressing his fingers to her wrist, then her neck. His movements were swift but methodical, his expression grim. He began chest compressions, water pooling beneath Lydia's body, but after several minutes he sat back, shaking his head. "She's gone," he said, his voice low. "Drowned, I'm afraid." A sob broke the silence. Evelyn Crane, who had rushed back from the rocks, fell to her knees beside Lydia, her hands covering her face. "No, oh no," she moaned, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple, standing now, observed the scene from a distance. Evelyn's grief was convincing, her cries drawing sympathetic glances, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The companion's hands, pressed to her cheeks, were dry, and her sobs lacked the ragged edge of true despair. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow who had wept similarly at her husband's funeral, only to be found later with a lover and a forged will. The crowd parted as Inspector Arthur Treglis arrived, summoned from the village station. A stocky man with a weathered face and keen grey eyes, he exuded quiet authority. His constable, a lanky youth named Pierce, trailed behind, notebook in hand. Tregillis surveyed the scene, his gaze lingering on Lydia's body, then moving to Dr. Langley. "What happened here, doctor?" he asked, his Cornish accent soft but firm. Langley rose, brushing sand from his trousers. "Found her in the water, floating near the rocks. No pulse when we pulled her out. I tried to revive her, but—" He trailed off, his brow furrowed. Tregillis nodded, turning to the crowd. "Did anyone see her go in?" Heads shook, and murmurs of denial followed. Clara Vernon, still pale, stepped forward. "I was painting by the rocks. I didn't see her until she was there, in the water." Her voice trembled, and she clutched her scarf. Chapter 3. Whispers of Doubt. The Cliffside Hotel, perched above St. Morwena's Bay, seemed to hold its breath in the wake of Lydia Ashford's death. The dining room, usually alive with the clink of cutlery and murmured conversations, was subdued. That evening, the guests' faces shadowed by the weight of tragedy. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small table near the window, her black dress unobtrusive, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The sea beyond the glass was a restless expanse, its waves catching the last light of dusk. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, absorbed in her wool. But her sharp blue eyes missed nothing, darting from face to face, sifting the undercurrents of unease that rippled through the room. The other guests ate in near silence, their glances flickering toward the empty chair where Lydia Ashford had sat the previous night. Miss Evelyn Crane, her companion, was absent, reportedly resting in her room after the ordeal on the beach. Mrs. Enid Carstairs, the hotel manager, moved among the tables, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her smile strained as she inquired about "The meal is everything to your liking, Miss Marple?" she asked, pausing briefly. Her hands twisted a napkin, betraying her nerves. Miss Marple inclined her head graciously. "Quite satisfactory, thank you," she replied, her tone mild. But her mind noting the manager's agitation, Enid's eyes darted toward the staircase, as if expecting Evelyn's return. Before she hurried away, at a nearby table, Dr. Hugh Langley, the retired physician, sat with Miss Clara Vernon, the painter. Their conversation was hushed, their heads bent close. Clara's crimson scarf, a vivid contrast to her pale face, trembled as she gestured. "It doesn't add up, Hugh," she whispered, her voice carrying just far enough for Miss Marple to catch. Lydia wasn't one for swimming, and in that shawl, so close to shore. Langley nodded, his weathered face troubled. "I've seen drownings before," he murmured. "This one sits wrong." Miss Marple's needles paused, her fingers poised as she absorbed the exchange. She pretended to adjust her shawl, her ears attuned to their words. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that doubt, once voiced, was a thread that could unravel even the tightest of lies. The dining room doors swung open, and Inspector Arthur Tregillis entered, his stocky frame filling the doorway. His grey eyes swept the room, and a hush fell as he approached Mrs. Carstairs. They conferred briefly, Enid's hands fluttering, before Tregillis took a seat at a corner table, his constable, young Pierce, hovering nearby with a notebook. The inspector's presence was a reminder of the morning's events, and the guests' subdued murmurs grew quieter still. Miss Marple observed Tregillis closely, noting the deliberate way he stirred his tea, his gaze lingering on each face. He was a man who saw more than he let on, she decided. Much like herself, Dinner concluded with a meagre dessert of baked apples, and the guests drifted to the lounge, where a fire crackled in the grate. Miss Marple settled in her usual chair, her knitting bag at her side, and opened her notebook under the guise of checking a pattern. In truth, she jotted down impressions: Clara's suspicion, Langley's unease, Enid's nerves, Evelyn's absence. Each was a piece in a puzzle, though the picture remained elusive. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a villager's death by misadventure, a fall from a ladder, had proved to be murder, revealed by a neighbour's too quick alibi. Here, the sea was the backdrop, but human nature, she knew, was the true stage. Clara. Vernon entered the lounge, her scarf trailing, and approached Dr. Langley, who stood by the fireplace. Their conversation resumed, their voices low but intense. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, strained to hear. "I keep thinking about her face," Clara said, her hands twisting. She looked, not surprised, but resigned, as if she knew. Langley frowned, rubbing his chin. "I noticed something else," he confided. Her hands were clenched, but not like someone who'd struggled, more like she'd been holding something. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Clenched hands could mean many things: fear, pain, or even a deliberate act. She recalled a St. Mary Mead seamstress, found dead with a needle in her fist, a clue to her killer's identity. Inspector Tregellis rose from his table and approached the pair, his manner unhurried. "Miss Vernon, Dr. Langley," he said, his Cornish accent soft. "A word, if you please." They moved to a corner, and Miss Marple adjusted her position, ostensibly to retrieve a dropped stitch, but in reality to eavesdrop. Tregellis's voice was calm but probing. "You were both on the beach this morning. Anything strike you as odd?" Clara hesitated, then spoke. "I didn't see Lydia go into the water. I was painting, but she was just there, floating." Langley cleared his throat. "The shallows are barely 3 feet deep, Inspector. Hard to drown accidentally unless she was unconscious first." Tregellis's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "Thank you. I'll need to speak with Miss Crane again tomorrow." As Tregellis returned to his seat, Miss Marple's mind raced. Langley's observation about the shallow water echoed his earlier comment on the beach, and Clara's mention of Lydia's expression added a new dimension. She thought of Evelyn Crane, whose dry hands and polished grief had jarred her on the beach. The companion's absence tonight was telling grief, perhaps, or calculation. Miss Marple's experience taught her that those closest to a victim often held the key to their fate, and Evelyn's role as Lydia's shadow warranted scrutiny. The lounge gradually emptied, the guests retiring early, their faces heavy with the day's events. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting a pretext as she watched Tregellis confer with Pierce. The inspector's frown, fleeting but distinct, suggested he shared Langley's doubts. When he approached her chair, his expression was polite but guarded. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, tipping his hat. "You were on the beach today. See anything worth mentioning?" She smiled demurely, her eyes twinkling. "Only the usual seaside comings and goings, Inspector. People are so careless. In the sun, don't you find?" Tregellis studied her, as if sensing her reticence. "Careless, indeed," he said, and moved on. Alone now, Miss Marple rose and approached the window, the sea a dark void beyond. She recalled her conversation with Tregellis on the beach, when she had gently inquired about Lydia's enemies. His mention of a recent will change, favouring Evelyn, had struck her as significant. Wills, she knew, were dangerous things, capable of twisting loyalties and sparking greed. In St. Mary Mead, a farmer's altered will had led to a poisoning, uncovered by a misplaced ledger. Here, the stakes seemed higher, the players more guarded. She returned to her room, her steps slow but purposeful. The corridor was silent, the hotel's grandeur muted by the hour. Her room, with its view of the bay, felt both comforting and oppressive, the sea's ceaseless murmur a reminder of Lydia's fate. She sat at the small writing desk, opened her notebook, and began to write in her precise script. Lydia Ashford nervous, withdrawn, dependent on Evelyn. Evelyn Crane poised, attentive, but calculated. Will changed in her favour. Dr. Langley. Doubts drowning, notes shallow water, clenched hands. Clara Vernon saw resignation in Lydia's face. Mrs. Carstairs, nervous, watchful. Inspector Tregillis, methodical, suspects more than he says. Each entry was a thread, and though the pattern was unclear, Miss Marple trusted it would emerge. She paused, her pen hovering, and considered Evelyn Crane, the companion's absence. Tonight could be grief, but her performance on the beach suggested otherwise. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead governess, whose tears for a lost child had masked theft, revealed by a hidden locket. Evelyn's dry hands, her too perfect sorrow, hinted at a similar facade. But what was her motive? The will was a start, but Miss Marple sensed something deeper, a secret Lydia had carried to her death. Closing her notebook, she moved to the window, the moonlight silvering the waves. The hotel was quiet, but its walls seemed to hum with unspoken truths. She thought of Clara's words about Lydia's resigned expression, Langley's mention of clenched hands, and Tregillis's frown. Each was a clue, small but vital, like the stitches in her knitting. She recalled a phrase from her youth: "Doubt is the crack through which truth slips." Doubt was stirring in St. Morwena's Bay, and Miss Marple intended to follow it. She prepared for bed, her movements deliberate, but her mind remained active. As she brushed her hair, she considered her next steps. A conversation with Clara might yield more about Lydia's expression, and Langley's medical insight could clarify the drowning's anomalies. Evelyn, too, must be approached, though with care, her polished surface likely to deflect direct questions. Miss Marple smiled faintly, recalling a St. Mary Mead busybody who had unravelled a theft by feigning ignorance. The same tactic might serve here. Slipping into bed, she left the curtains open, the sea's rhythm lulling her. Her last thought, as sleep claimed her, was of Lydia Ashford, alone in the shallows, her clenched hands a silent plea. Tomorrow, Miss Marple resolved, she would begin to listen. Chapter 4. The Companion's Tale, Inquest into Lydia. Ashford's death was held 2 days later in the village hall of St. Morwena's Bay, a squat stone building nestled between the post office and a cobbler's shop. The hall's interior was stuffy, its high windows admitting slants of morning light that fell across rows of wooden benches packed with locals and hotel guests. Miss Jane Marple sat at the back, her black hat tilted to shield her eyes, her knitting bag resting on her lap. To the unobservant, she was merely an elderly spinster, drawn by curiosity to the proceedings. But her sharp gaze catalogued every detail: the fidgeting of the villagers, the sombre faces of the hotel staff, and the measured tread of Inspector Arthur Tregillis as he conferred with the coroner. The air hummed with anticipation, and Miss Marple, her needles idle for once, sensed the weight of secrets waiting to be aired. The coroner, Mr. Basil Penwith, was a lean man with a reedy voice. and a penchant for adjusting his spectacles. He opened the inquest with a dry summary of the facts. Mrs. Lydia Ashford, aged 54, found drowned in the shallows of St. Morwenna's Bay on the morning of June 18, 1925. The room stirred as he called the first witness, Dr. Hugh Langley, who took the stand with a grave expression. His testimony was precise, detailing his efforts to revive Lydia on the beach and his initial conclusion of drowning. No visible injuries, he said, his hands clasped, but the shallows were shallow 3 feet at most. It struck me as unusual. Penwith pressed him, asking if Lydia might have fainted or been intoxicated. Langley shook his head. No signs of that, though I couldn't rule out a medical event. Miss Marple's lips pursed, noting his careful phrasing. Langley's doubt, voiced earlier in the lounge, lingered here, a subtle challenge to the official narrative. Next came Miss Clara Vernon, her crimson scarf a jarring note against the hall's muted tones. She spoke haltingly, describing her discovery of Lydia's body while painting near the rocks. I looked up, and there she was, floating, Clara said, her hands twisting. I didn't see her go in. The coroner asked if she'd noticed anything odd about Lydia's behavior earlier. Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the front row where Miss Evelyn Crane sat. She seemed quiet, wrapped in her shawl, not like someone planning a swim. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her mind snagging on Clara's pause. Hesitation, she knew from St. Mary Mead, often hid more than it revealed. The room's attention shifted as Evelyn Crane was called to the stand. She rose, a picture of composed grief in a tailored black dress, her dark hair swept into a neat chignon. Her steps were measured, her face pale but serene, and as she took the oath, her voice was soft yet clear. Miss Marple watched closely, recalling Evelyn's dry hands on the beach, her sobs too polished for true despair. The coroner began gently, asking about her relationship with Lydia. I was her companion for 2 years, Evelyn said, her eyes downcast. She was like family to me. She described Lydia as melancholic, prone to solitary walks by the sea. She loved the water, though she rarely swam. That morning I left her in her chair to explore the rock pools. When I returned, I heard Miss Vernon's scream. Her voice trembled artfully, and a murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Penwith probed further, asking about Lydia's health and state of mind. Evelyn's answers were smooth, painting a picture of a fragile widow dependent on her companion's care. She was nervous, easily tired, Evelyn said. I worried about her, but she insisted on coming to the beach. The coroner nodded, then asked about the will, a question that drew a collective intake of breath. Evelyn's composure faltered, for a moment, her fingers tightening on her handkerchief. Mrs. Ashford changed her will last month, leaving me a portion of her estate. She said I'd been a comfort to her. The room buzzed, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A will, she thought, was a motive as old as time. But Evelyn's quick recovery, her sorrowful smile returning, suggested a deeper game. Inspector Tregillis was called next, his testimony brief but weighty. He described the scene on the beach, the lack of struggle marks, and the preliminary findings. No evidence of foul play, he said, his Cornish accent steady. The post-mortem suggests drowning, though we're awaiting further tests. His tone was neutral, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of reserve in his eyes, as if he held back more than he shared. The coroner, satisfied, concluded the inquest with a verdict of accidental death, pending final reports. The crowd dispersed, their whispers trailing like smoke. Miss Marple lingered outside the hall, her hat shielding her from the midday sun. The village square bustled with activity, fishermen hauling nets, children darting between carts, but her thoughts were on Evelyn Crane. The companion's testimony had been a performance, each word chosen to deflect suspicion. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead shopgirl whose tearful tale of a lost ring had masked a theft undone by a single careless glance. Evelyn's glance, too, had betrayed her fleeting look toward the door, as if expecting an interruption. What, Miss Marple wondered, did she fear? Back at the Cliffside Hotel, the mood remained somber. Miss Marple took tea in the lounge, her chair positioned to observe the comings and goings. The room was quieter than usual, the guests' conversations muted. Dr. Langley sat alone, reading a medical journal, his brow furrowed. Clara Vernon sketched in a corner, her pencil scratching furiously. Mrs. Enid Carstairs moved through the room, her nervous hands adjusting vases and cushions. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the inquest. The verdict of accidental death sat poorly with her, like a dress with uneven seams. Langley's comment about the shallow water, Clara's hint of Lydia's quiet demeanour, and Evelyn's polished grief all pointed to something staged, something deliberate. Evelyn appeared at last, descending the staircase with a grace that drew eyes. She wore a grey dress, its simplicity accentuating her poise, and carried a small book, which she opened as she sat by the window. Miss Marple seized the opportunity, gathering her knitting and moving to a nearby chair. "Miss Crane," she began, her voice warm, "I hope you're bearing up." Such a dreadful shock. Evelyn looked up, her smile tinged with sadness. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's been difficult." Her eyes were dry, her tone measured. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of kindly concern. "You were so devoted to Mrs. Ashford. It must be a comfort to have been such a support." Evelyn nodded, her fingers tightening on the book. "I tried my best. She was a dear soul, but so fragile." Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone gently probing. "Fragile, yes. I noticed her nervousness. Did she ever speak of worries, perhaps about her health or her affairs?" Evelyn's smile stiffened, but she answered smoothly, "Only the usual. Concerns of a widow. She trusted me to manage things." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "How fortunate she found you. Companions are so hard to come by, aren't they? How did you meet?" Evelyn's hesitation was brief, but Miss Marple caught it. "Through an advertisement," she said. "I'd been a governess before, but I wanted a quieter role. Lydia Mrs. Ashford was kind enough to take me on." The story was plausible, yet Miss Marple sensed a gap, a detail left unsaid. She smiled, changing tack. "You must have many happy memories of her. Did she enjoy St. Morwenna's Bay?" Evelyn relaxed slightly, describing Lydia's love for the sea, her quiet walks, her fondness for the hotel. But her words, though fluent, lacked warmth. As if recited from a script, their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Carstairs, who approached with a tray of scones. "Miss Crane, you must eat something," she urged, her voice overly bright. Evelyn thanked her, and Miss Marple noted the manager's quick glance at the companion, a mix of concern and something else, wariness, perhaps. As Enid retreated, Miss Marple rose, excusing herself with a smile. "I mustn't keep you, Miss Crane. Rest well." Evelyn nodded, her eyes following Miss Marple as she returned to her chair, alone again. Miss Marple opened her notebook, jotting down Evelyn's words: advertisement, governess, trusted me to manage things. The companion's story was tidy, but its edges frayed under scrutiny. Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, where a new housemaid's vague past had led to a theft, uncovered by a letter found in a drawer. Evelyn's past, she suspected, held similar clues, waiting to be found. That evening, the lounge filled with guests, their moods slightly lifted by the inquest's closure. Dr. Langley approached Miss Marple, his journal tucked under his arm. "You were at the inquest," he said, his voice low. "What did you make of it?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression mild. "A sad affair, Doctor, but the sea can be deceptive, can't it?" Langley frowned, sensing her meaning. "Deceptive, yes. I can't shake the feeling we're missing something." Her hands clenched like that. He trailed off, and Miss Marple nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Clenched hands can tell a story," she said softly. "In my village, a woman's fist held a button from her killer's coat." Langley's eyes widened, but he said no. More, retreating to his seat. Clara Vernon joined them later, her sketchbook open to a drawing of the beach. "I keep seeing her face," she confided, her voice unsteady, not frightened, but accepting. "It haunts me." Miss Marple listened, her mind turning over Clara's words. Acceptance could mean many things: resignation, knowledge, or even complicity. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow, whose calm demeanor before her death had masked a suicide revealed by a hidden note. Lydia's expression, as Clara described, it suggested a truth yet to be uncovered. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple watched Evelyn, who had joined a group playing cards. Her laughter was bright, her manner charming, but Miss Marple noted a tension in her shoulders, a glance toward the door. The companion was guarded, her ease a facade. Miss Marple thought of Inspector Tregulus, whose reserve at the inquest hinted at unspoken suspicions. She resolved to speak with him again, to share her observations without revealing too much. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that police, while methodical, often needed a nudge to see the human side of a case. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple stood by the window, the sea a dark mirror under the stars. She opened her notebook, adding to her notes, "Evelyn, vague past advertisement, will beneficiary. Clenched hands, accepting expression, Tregulus, reserved, testing further." The pieces were scattered, but Miss Marple trusted they would form a pattern. She thought of Lydia, alone in the shallows, her life extinguished in a moment of deception. The companion's tale, she felt certain, was the key. Its truth hidden in the spaces between Evelyn's words. In bed, she left the curtains open, the sea's rhythm a steady pulse. Her mind, as ever, was restless, sifting through impressions. Evelyn's hesitation, Langley's doubt, Clara's haunting image wall were threads in a tapestry of deceit. Miss Marple smiled faintly, recalling a St. Mary Mead proverb, "Truth hides in plain sight, if you know where to look." Tomorrow, she would look closer, her gentle questions a net to catch the unwary. Chapter 5. A visit to the vicarage. The morning following the inquest dawned with a soft mist over St. Morwenna's Bay, veiling the cliffs and muting the sea's restless churn. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the rhythms of a new day, rose early, her small figure wrapped in a woolen shawl as she sipped tea by her window at the Cliffside Hotel. The events of the past, days Lydia Ashford's drowning, Evelyn Crane's polished testimony, the undercurrents of doubt voiced by Dr. Langley and Clara Vernon had woven a complex web in her mind. Her sharp blue eyes, undimmed by age, gazed at the mist, seeing not just the landscape but the outlines of a mystery yet to be resolved. She felt the need for a broader perspective, a glimpse into the village's pulse, and resolved to visit the vicarage, where local knowledge often flowed as freely as tea. After a modest breakfast of poached eggs and toast, Miss Marple donned her black coat and a sensible hat, its brim tilted to ward off the damp. Her canvas bag, containing her knitting and notebook, hung from her arm as she set out along the cliff path toward the village. The air was cool, scented with salt and gorse, and the path wound past stone walls and wildflowers, offering glimpses of the bay below. She walked slowly, her steps deliberate, but her mind was agile, sifting through the inquest's revelations. Evelyn's mention of a will favouring her, Langley's unease about the shallow water, Clara's haunting image of Lydia's resigned expression, all were fragments, like the scattered stitches of an unfinished pattern. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that villagers held secrets in their quiet corners, and she trusted St. Morwenna's Bay would be no different. The vicarage stood at the edge of the village, a rambling Georgian house with ivy-clad walls and a garden bursting with roses. Miss Marple knocked, and the door was opened by Mrs. Penrose, a plump woman with a warm smile and flower-dusted hands. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," she said, ushering her into a cosy parlour where a fire crackled. The vicar, Mr. Reginald Penrose, rose from an armchair, his scholarly face lighting with interest. A man in his 60s, with thinning hair and a penchant for quoting Donne. He had a reputation for knowing the village's history as well as its gossip. "Pleasure, Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to a chintz-covered chair. "We've heard of the sad business at the hotel. Tea." Mrs. Penrose bustled off to fetch a tray, and Miss Marple settled in, her knitting bag at her side. The parlour was cluttered with books and family photographs, a contrast to the hotel's polished elegance. She opened the conversation with gentle inquiries about the village, easing into the topic of Lydia Ashford. "Such a tragedy," she said, her tone sympathetic. "I understand Mrs. Ashford was a regular visitor. Did you know her well?" Penrose adjusted his spectacles, his expression thoughtful. "Not intimately, but she attended services when she stayed at the cliffside. A reserved woman, generous with the collection plate, but guarded in conversation." Mrs. Penrose returned, with tea and scones, her apron dusted with flour. "Poor soul," she said, pouring. "Always wrapped in that shawl, even in summer. I thought her frail, but she had a certain strength." Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. "And her companion, Miss Crane?" she asked, her voice mild. Penrose frowned slightly, exchanging a glance with his wife. "A newcomer, relatively speaking," he said. "She arrived with Mrs. Ashford 2 years ago. Polite, but distant. Keeps to herself when they're not at the hotel." Mrs. Penrose leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Some in the village thought her too attentive, if you take my meaning. Always hovering, like a shadow." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew out her knitting, her fingers moving automatically. The Penroses' words echoed her own observations of Evelyn's calculated care, and she probed further, her questions cloaked in kindly curiosity. Mrs. Ashford must have valued such devotion. Did she ever speak of her family or her past? Penrose rubbed his chin. She mentioned a brother in London, George Ashford, who managed her affairs. A wealthy widow, you see, left comfortable by her husband's shipping business. But she was private, rarely spoke of personal matters. Mrs. Penrose added, "I heard she'd been widowed young, poor thing. No children, which made her companion all the more important, I suppose." The conversation turned to village life, but Miss Marple steered it back subtly, asking about Evelyn's background. Miss Crane seemed so poised. She said, "I wonder where she came from before joining Mrs. Ashford." The Penroses exchanged another glance, and Mrs. Penrose shrugged. She never said much. "I assumed she'd been a governess or nurse. Her manner suggests training, but she's not one for sharing." Penrose nodded. "I recall her posting letters at the village shop, always to London addresses. Official-looking envelopes, though I couldn't say to whom." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained bland. Letters, she thought, could reveal much, as they had in St. Mary Mead, when a postman's idle remark, unmasked, "ABLACKMAILER," as she nibbled a scone. Miss Marple reflected on the Penroses' insights. Lydia's wealth, her reclusive nature, her brother's role, and Evelyn's vague past formed a picture, incomplete but suggestive. The vicar's mention of letters piqued her interest, and she filed it away, alongside Evelyn's testimony about the will in St. Mary Mead. A widow's altered will had led to a murder uncovered by a solicitor's slip. Here, the stakes seemed equally high. With Evelyn at the centre of a web Miss Marple was determined to untangle. Thanking the Penroses, she rose to leave, pausing to admire the garden. As Mrs. Penrose showed her out, Miss Marple caught sight of Evelyn Crane in the village square, posting a letter at the red pillar box. The companion's posture was tense, her glance darting as if wary of being seen. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The timing was curious, so soon after the inquest, and she wondered what urgency drove Evelyn to write. Bidding Mrs. Penrose farewell, she walked slowly toward the square, her steps measured but her mind racing. The village was bustling, with fishermen unloading their catch and shopkeepers sweeping doorsteps. Miss Marple lingered near the post office, pretending to study a notice board while observing Evelyn. The companion, now crossing the square, carried a small parcel, her expression guarded. She entered the general store, and Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her hat shielding her face. Inside, the shop smelled of soap and tobacco, its shelves crammed with goods. Evelyn stood at the counter, purchasing stamps, her voice low as she spoke to the shopkeeper, a wiry man named Mr. Trelawney. Miss Marple browsed a display of postcards, her ears attuned. "Another letter to London, Miss Crane?" Trelawney asked, his tone jovial. Evelyn nodded, her smile tight. "Just business matters," she said, slipping the stamps into her purse. Miss Marple noted the exchange, her mind turning over the Penroses' mention of official envelopes. Business matters, she thought, could mean many things: legal affairs, financial dealings, or something less benign. She recalled a St. Mary Mead clerk, whose frequent letters to a cousin had masked an embezzlement scheme exposed by a postmark. Evelyn's letters, she resolved, warranted inquiry inquiry. Leaving the shop, Miss Marple returned to the hotel, the mist now lifting to reveal a pale sun. The Cliffside's lobby was quiet, the staff moving with subdued efficiency. Mrs. Enid Carstairs greeted her, her nervous hands adjusting a vase of lilies. "A pleasant walk, Miss Marple?" she asked, her smile forced. Miss Marple nodded, her tone warm. "Most refreshing, Mrs. Carstairs. The village is charming." Enid's eyes flickered, as if searching for hidden meaning, and Miss Marple made a mental note of her unease. The manager, she sensed, knew more than she let on. Her nerves a thread worth following. In her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook. her precise script capturing the morning's findings. Vicarage, Lydia, wealthy. Widowed young brother George, in London. Evelyn, distant, letters to London, official envelopes. Village, Evelyn posting, letter, tense, parcel, business matters. Mrs. Carstairs, increasingly nervous. Each entry was a stitch, and though the pattern remained elusive, Miss Marple felt its shape emerging. She thought of Evelyn's furtive glance in the square, a mirror to her guarded demeanour at the inquest. In St. Mary Mead, such glances had often betrayed guilt, as with a poacher caught by a gamekeeper's lantern. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea in the lounge, her chair positioned to observe the guests. Dr. Langley sat by the window, his medical journal open but unread, his brow furrowed. Clara Vernon sketched at a corner table, her pencil pausing as she stared into space. Evelyn entered, her grey dress understated, and joined a group playing bridge. Her laughter was bright, but Miss Marple noted a strain in her eyes, a flicker of watchfulness. Seizing the moment, she approached, her knitting bag in hand. "Miss Crane, may I join you for a moment?" she asked, her voice kindly. Evelyn looked up, her smile polite but wary. "Of course, Miss Marple." They sat, and Miss Marple drew out her needles, her questions gentle. "I was in the village today, such a quaint place. Do you often walk there?" Evelyn's fingers tightened on her cards. "Now and then, for errands," she said. Miss Marple nodded, her tone casual. "I saw you at the post office. Keeping in touch with family, perhaps?" Evelyn's smile stiffened. "Just some correspondence. Nothing important." Her deflection was swift, and Miss Marple let it pass, shifting to memories of Lydia. Evelyn's responses were warm but vague, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. Their conversation was brief, interrupted by Clara, who approached with her sketchbook. "Miss Marple, I've been meaning to ask, do you draw?" she said, her tone eager. Miss Marple smiled, sensing an ally. "Not since my school days, my dear, but I admire your work." Clara sat, showing her sketches of the bay, and Miss Marple steered the talk to the beach. "You saw so much that day," she said softly. "It must weigh on you." Clara's face clouded. "It does." Her face, so still, "I can't shake it." Evelyn excused herself, her departure abrupt, and Miss Marple noted her haste. Alone with Clara, Miss Marple probed gently. Learning that Clara had seen Evelyn near the rocks before the scream, her posture purposeful. "I didn't think much of it then," Clara admitted. "But now," Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the detail. In St. Mary Mead, a gardener's fleeting presence in a shed had led to a theft's unravelling. Evelyn's movements, she suspected, held similar significance. That evening, Miss Marple wrote to her friend Sir Henry Clithering, a retired Scotland Yard commissioner, requesting discreet inquiries into Lydia Ashford's brother and Evelyn Crane's background. She sealed the letter, her thoughts on the village square, where Evelyn's furtive letter had hinted at a hidden truth. The vicarage had opened a window into Lydia's world, but Evelyn remained the enigma, her tale a carefully woven lie. Miss Marple stood by her window, the sea a dark expanse under the moon. In St. Mary Mead, truth had often emerged from the smallest cracks, a glance, a letter, a pause. Here she would find it, stitch by stitch, until the pattern was clear. Chapter 6. The Painter's Observation. The cliffside hotel awoke to a morning of restless energy, as if the mist that had cloaked St. Morwenna's Bay had seeped into its halls, stirring unease among the guests. Miss Jane Marple, ever punctual, sat in the dining room over a breakfast of kippers and tea, her small figure unassuming in a corner by the window. The sea beyond sparkled under a tentative sun, its surface deceptively calm. Her sharp blue eyes, hidden behind a polite smile, scanned the room, noting the strained faces of her fellow diners. The inquest's verdict of accidental death had closed one chapter of Lydia Ashford's story, but Miss Marple sensed another was unfolding, its pages written in the glances and silences of those around her. Her visit to the vicarage had deepened. Her suspicions and Evelyn Crane's furtive letter in the village square lingered in her mind like a dropped stitch in her knitting. The dining room hummed with subdued conversation. Dr. Hugh Langley, the retired physician, sat alone, his fork moving mechanically as he stared at his plate. Mrs. Enid Carstairs, the hotel manager, flitted between tables, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her nervous hands adjusting napkins with unnecessary vigor. Miss Clara Vernon, the painter, entered late, her crimson scarf trailing as she carried a sketchbook under her arm. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, as if the weight of Lydia's death pressed on her still. Miss Marple's needles, drawn from her canvas bag, clicked softly as she began a new row, her fingers steady but her mind alert. Clara's hesitant testimony at the inquest, coupled with her haunting description of Lydia's resigned expression, had marked her as a potential ally, and Miss Marple resolved to draw her out. Clara chose a table near Miss Marple's, her movements distracted as she ordered tea. Miss Marple seized the moment, her voice warm and inviting. "Good morning, Miss Vernon. I trust you're finding some solace in your art." Clara looked up, startled, then offered a faint smile. "It helps, Miss Marple. Painting keeps my mind from wandering." Her fingers traced the edge of her sketchbook, and Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression kindly. "Such a gift, to capture what you see. I imagine you notice things others miss." Clara's smile wavered, and she nodded, her eyes darting to the window. "Sometimes too much," she murmured. Encouraged, Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her needles pausing. "It must be difficult after what happened on the beach. You were so close to it all." Clara's hands tightened on her sketchbook, and she glanced around, ensuring no one was near. "It's haunted me," she admitted, her voice low. "I was painting by the rocks, focused on the light on the water. Then I saw her Mrs. Ashford floating, so still. But before that," she hesitated, her brow furrowing. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained bland. "Before that, my dear," she prompted gently, her tone that of a sympathetic. Aunt Clara leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw Miss Crane near the rocks just before the scream. She wasn't wandering or looking at the pools, like she said. She was purposeful, as if she had a reason to be there. I didn't think much of it then, but now it feels wrong." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning over the revelation. Clara's observation was a new thread, vivid and telling, like a bright yarn in a muted pattern. She recalled a St. Mary Mead baker, whose casual mention of a stranger's movements had unravelled a burglary. Evelyn's presence at the rocks, purposeful and unreported, was a clue that demanded attention. "You've a keen eye," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "Have you shared this with Inspector Trigillus?" Clara shook her head, her fingers twisting her scarf. "It seemed so small, and I wasn't sure. I didn't want to accuse anyone." Miss Marple nodded, her expression reassuring. "Quite right to be cautious, my dear, but small things can matter. In my village, A misplaced glove once led to a thief's capture. Clara's eyes widened, and she promised to speak with the inspector, her resolve bolstered by Miss Marple's calm certainty. As Clara sipped her tea, Miss Marple probed further, her questions cloaked in gentle curiosity. "You mentioned Mrs. Ashford's expression at the inquest. It struck you, didn't it?" Clara's face clouded, her voice trembling. "Yes, she wasn't frightened or struggling. She looked accepting, as if she'd expected it. I can't explain it, but it stayed with me." Miss Marple lips pursed, her mind cataloguing the detail. Acceptance could mean resignation, knowledge, or even a choice, as in the case of a St. Mary Mead spinster whose serene death had masked a deliberate overdose revealed by a hidden vial. Lydia's expression, coupled with Evelyn's movements, suggested a narrative far from accidental. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Evelyn Crane, who entered the dining room with her usual poise. Her grey dress was immaculate, her dark hair sleek, but Miss Marple noted a tightness in her smile, a flicker of wariness in her eyes. Evelyn nodded politely to Clara and Miss Marple before taking a table across the room, where she opened a novel and began to read. Miss Marple watched her, recalling the companion's vague answers about her past and her furtive letter in the village. Evelyn's presence at the rocks, as Clara described, cast her testimony in a new light, and Miss Marple resolved to press her further, though with the subtlety her St. Mary Mead experience had honed. Breakfast concluded, and the guests dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the hotel's grand corridors. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting a pretext, as she observed Evelyn, who now conversed with Mrs. Carstairs near the lobby. The manager's nervous hands fluttered, and Evelyn's smile seemed to soothe her, though her eyes remained watchful. Miss Marple made a mental note of their interaction, sensing a dynamic she had yet to fully grasp. Mrs. Carstairs, with her persistent unease, was another piece in the puzzle, her role unclear but significant. Returning to her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook, her precise script capturing Clara's revelation. Clara Vernon saw Evelyn near rocks before scream, purposeful, not wandering. Lydia's expression, accepting, not frightened. Evelyn, tense, watchful today. She paused, her pen hovering, and considered the implications. Evelyn's movements suggested intent, perhaps preparation, and Clara's observation strengthened the case against an accidental drowning. Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's unnoticed presence in a barn had led to a murder's unravelling. Here, the rocks were the stage, and Evelyn's role was increasingly suspect. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. Langley stood in the corridor, his weathered face grave. "Miss Marple, a word," he said, his voice low. She invited him in, offering a chair by the window. Langley sat, his hands clasped, and spoke without preamble. "I've been thinking about Lydia Ashford. I examined her on the beach, as you know, and something's been nagging at me. There was no water in her lungs." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained mild. "No water, doctor," she prompted, her tone inviting confidence. Langley nodded, his brow furrowed. "In a drowning, you would expect water in the lungs, even in shallow water. But her lungs were clear, as if she'd stopped breathing before she entered the sea. I mentioned it to Tregulus, but the post-mortem's still pending." Miss Marple's needles, now in her lap, were still, her mind racing. Langley's revelation was a bombshell, transforming the case from a questionable drowning to a probable murder. She recalled a St. Mary Mead farmer found in a stream with dry lungs. His death traced to a poisoning uncovered by a chemist's report. Most curious, she said softly. It suggests she was incapacitated, perhaps, before the water. Langley leaned forward, his voice urgent. Exactly. And her hands, clenched like that, not a struggle, but a reflex, as if she'd been holding something or reacting to pain. I've seen it in cases of poisoning or sudden collapse. Miss Marple nodded, her mind aligning Langley's findings with Clara's observation and Evelyn's movements. You've a sharp mind, Doctor, she said, her eyes twinkling. In my village, such details often pointed to the truth. Langley smiled faintly, but his expression was troubled. I hope Tregler sees it. He's thorough, but cautious. As Langley left, Miss Marple stood by the window, the sea a restless expanse below. Langley's revelation was a turning point, shifting the case from suspicion to certainty. Lydia had not drowned accidentally. She had been killed, her body placed in the shallows to deceive. Evelyn's presence at the rocks, her control over Lydia's life, her beneficiary status in the Woolor, pointed to her as the architect of the crime. But why? Greed was a simple motive, but Miss Marple sensed a deeper thread. A secret Lydia had carried and Evelyn had sought to bury. That afternoon, Miss Marple joined the guests in the lounge, her chair positioned to observe Evelyn, who played bridge with a group of young men. Her laughter was bright, but Miss Marple noted a strain in her posture, a glance toward the door as if expecting an interruption. Seizing a moment when Evelyn stepped away, Miss Marple approached Clara, who was sketching by the fireplace. My dear, she said, her voice low, your observation about Miss Crane is most valuable. Would you consider telling Inspector Tregillis? Discreetly, of course. Clara hesitated, then nodded, her resolve strengthened by Miss Marple's calm assurance. I will, she said. It's been weighing on me. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. She thought of Inspector Tregillis, whose reserve at the inquest suggested he shared her doubts. Langley's medical evidence, combined with Clara's testimony, might push him to act. In St. Mary Mead, a constable's reluctance had been overcome by a villager's persistent clues, leading to an arrest. Here, Miss Marple would nudge gently, her questions a catalyst for truth. As evening fell, the hotel grew quiet, the guests retiring early. Miss Marple lingered in the lounge, her notebook open under the guise of checking a pattern. She added Langley's findings: no water in lungs, clenched hands, possible poisoning or collapse. Evelyn at rocks, purposeful. The case was taking shape, its outlines clearer but its heart still hidden. She thought of Evelyn's letter, her guarded answers, her watchful eyes. In St. Mary Mead, a servant's secret correspondence had led to a blackmailer's exposure, uncovered by a postmistress's sharp memory. Evelyn's letters, Miss Marple resolved, must be traced. Standing by her window, the sea a dark mirror under the stars, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery. Lydia's death was no accident, but a calculated act, its roots buried in Evelyn's past. The painter's observation had lit a path, and Miss Marple would follow it, her gentle persistence unravelling the lies that bound the truth. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that human nature, however guarded, always left a trace, a glance, a movement, a moment of carelessness. Here she would find it, stitch by stitch, until the pattern was complete. Chapter 7. The letter from London. The cliffside hotel stood sentinel over St. Morwenna's Bay. its red brick facade catching the pale light of a June morning in 1925. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken questions, as if the walls themselves absorbed the tension of Lydia Ashford's death. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner of the lounge, sipped tea and worked her knitting needles with a steady rhythm, her frail appearance belying the keen mind that sifted through the cases. Complexities. The revelations of the past day's Clara Vernon's sighting of Evelyn Crane near the rocks. Dr. Langley's discovery of no water in Lydia's lungs. The vicarage's hints at Evelyn's vague past had sharpened her suspicions. Yet the motive and method remained elusive, like a pattern half-knit, its final shape just out of reach. Today, she awaited a letter from her friend Sir Henry Clithering, whose London connections might illuminate the shadows surrounding Lydia and her companion. The lounge was quieter than usual, the guests subdued by the lingering shadow of the inquest's accidental death verdict. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes, hidden behind a demure smile, scanned the room. Mrs. Enid Carstairs, the hotel manager, adjusted a vase of roses with her characteristic nervous flutter, her auburn hair pinned tightly as if to restrain her unease. Dr. Langley read a newspaper, his brow furrowed, while Clara Vernon sketched at a window table, her crimson scarf a vivid contrast to her distracted expression. Evelyn Crane was absent, a fact Miss Marple noted with interest. The companion's polished presence had been a constant since the tragedy, and her absence today suggested either retreat or calculation. A young porter approached, bearing a silver tray with a single envelope. "For you, Miss Marple," he said. Bowing slightly, she thanked him, her fingers deftly opening the letter, which bore Sir Henry's familiar crest. Settling her knitting in her lap, she read, her expression bland but her mind alert. Sir Henry's neat script confirmed Lydia Ashford's substantial fortune, inherited from her late husband's shipping empire and managed by her brother, George Ashford, a London solicitor. The will, recently altered, named Evelyn Crane as the primary beneficiary, a change George had contested, suspecting undue influence. George claims Lydia was vulnerable, Sir Henry wrote, easily swayed by her companion's attentions. No record of Evelyn Crane exists prior to 1923, despite her claim of a governess background. George's inquiries into her past hit a dead end. Miss Marple's lips pursed, the letter's contents a bright thread in the tapestry of her suspicions. A contested will and a companion with no traceable history pointed to more than greed, perhaps a deeper deception. She tucked the letter into her canvas bag, her thoughts turning to Evelyn's furtive letter in the village square and Clara's observation of her purposeful movements near the rocks. Dr. Langley's medical evidence: no water in Lydia's lungs, clenched hands suggesting poisoning or collapse had transformed the case from a questionable drowning to a probable murder. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had unravelled a poisoning by noting a villager's sudden purchase of rat bait. Here, the method was unclear, but Evelyn's role grew clearer with each revelation. Sir Henry's letter, she decided, warranted sharing with Inspector Treglis, whose cautious approach might be swayed by hard evidence. Rising, Miss Marple made her way to the lobby, where Mrs. Carstairs was instructing a maid. The manager's eyes flickered with unease as Miss Marple approached, her smile forced. "A fine morning, Miss Marple. Off for a walk?" Miss Marple nodded, her tone warm. "Perhaps later, Mrs. Carstairs. I wondered if Inspector Tregillis has called today." Enid's hands twisted her apron. "Not yet, but he's expected. Such a dreadful business." Miss Marple smiled, noting the manager's persistent nerves. Indeed, one hopes for clarity soon. Enid's nod was curt, and Miss Marple moved on, her mind cataloguing the exchange. Mrs. Carstairs, she sensed, was a bystander caught in the mystery's orbit, her anxiety a clue to some hidden knowledge. Outside, the village bustled under a clearing sky. Miss Marple walked to the police station, a modest building near the harbour, where gulls wheeled above fishing boats. Inspector Treglis was at his desk, his stocky frame bent over a report. He rose as she entered, his grey eyes appraising. "Miss Marple, an unexpected visit," he said, his Cornish accent soft but wary. "Something to share." She settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, and spoke with gentle precision. "I've had a letter from a friend in London, Inspector, concerning Mrs. Ashford's affairs. It seems her will was recently changed, favouring Miss Crane, and her brother contested it, suspecting coercion. Miss Crane's past, I'm told, is curiously blank before 1923. Tregillis's frown deepened, his fingers drumming on the desk. "That tallies with my own inquiries," he admitted. "We've found no trace of her earlier life. Your friend's information is timely." Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone mild. "Dr. Langley's findings, too, suggest more than an accident. No water in the lungs is most unusual, don't you think?" Tregillis nodded, his reserve softening. "It's troubling, Miss Marple. The post-mortem's still pending, but I'm leaning toward foul play. Miss Vernon's statement about seeing Crane near the rocks doesn't help her case." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained bland. "Small details, Inspector, often tell the largest stories. In my village, a misplaced key once led to a killer's door." Tregillis studied her, a grudging respect in his gaze. "You've a knack for seeing those details, Miss Marple. I'll keep you informed." As she left the station, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Tregillis, though cautious, was moving toward the truth, nudged by her gentle prodding. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a constable's skepticism had yielded to a spinster's persistence, uncovering a theft. Here, the stakes were higher, but the method was the same: patience, observation, and a trust in human nature's inevitable slip. Returning to the hotel, she paused in the lobby, where Evelyn Crane was descending the staircase, her grey dress impeccable, her expression composed but strained. Miss Marple noted the companion's quick glance around, as if wary of scrutiny, and filed it away. That afternoon, the hotel hosted a small garden party, a tentative effort to lift the guests' spirits. Tables were set on the lawn, adorned with linen and wildflowers, and a string quartet played softly. Miss Marple, in a lavender dress and her sensible hat, mingled with the guests, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Clara Vernon stood by, a rosebush sketching the scene, her face less haunted than before. Dr. Langley chatted with a group of locals, his laughter forced. Evelyn moved among the crowd, her smile charming but her eyes watchful, like a cat in a room of mice. Miss Marple observed her, noting how she deflected questions about Lydia with practiced ease, steering talk to the weather or the music. Seizing a moment, Miss Marple approached Evelyn, her tone kindly. "Miss Crane, how lovely to see you out. The garden is a bomb, isn't it?" Evelyn nodded, her smile tight. "It's a welcome distraction, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew out her knitting, her questions gentle. "You must miss Mrs. Ashford terribly. Did she enjoy such gatherings?" Evelyn's eyes flickered, but she answered smoothly. She preferred quieter moments, but she appreciated beauty. Miss Marple nodded, shifting tack. I understand. She had family in London, a brother, perhaps. Did he visit? Evelyn's fingers tightened on her teacup. George, yes. He was busy, but they corresponded. Her tone was clipped, and Miss Marple let the subject drop, her mind noting the tension as the party continued. Miss Marple wandered to the edge of the lawn, where a path led to the cliff's edge. She stood, gazing at the sea, when Clara approached, her sketchbook under her arm. Miss Marple, I spoke to Tregillis, she said, her voice low, about seeing Evelyn at the rocks. He was interested, asked me to keep it quiet. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Well done, my dear. You've done right. Clara hesitated, then added, I remembered something else. Lydia's shallot was loose, trailing in the water, not wrapped tight like she usually wore it. Miss Marple's lips pursed, the details striking her. A loose shawl suggested haste or carelessness, perhaps in staging the scene, in St. Mary. Mead, a dishevelled scarf, had pointed to a struggle, leading to a killer's confession. Returning to the party, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Evelyn, who stood alone by a table, her gaze fixed on a small photograph she'd slipped from. Her purse. The companion's expression was unguarded for a moment, a mix of longing and fear, before she tucked the photograph away. Miss Marple, pretending to adjust her hat, moved closer, her voice soft. A keepsake, Miss Crane. Evelyn started, her hand closing over her purse. Just a memento of Lydia, she said, her smile returning too quickly. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A photograph, hidden and cherished, could hold a secret, as had a locket in St. Mary Mead, revealing a forbidden affair. That evening, Miss Marple dined in the hotel restaurant, her table offering a view of Evelyn, who sat with Mrs. Carstairs. The manager's nervous gestures were pronounced, her eyes darting to Evelyn as if seeking reassurance. Miss Marple noted their dynamic, sensing Enid's fear stemmed from more than the tragedy's aftermath. After dinner, she lingered in the lounge, where Dr. Langley approached, his face grave. Miss Marple, I've been thinking about the poisoning. Angle, he said, his voice low. If Lydia was drugged, it'd explain the dry lungs and clenched hands. Sedatives, perhaps, easily slipped into a drink. Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild. A plausible theory, Doctor. In my village, a chemist's records once traced a poison to its source. Langley's eyes widened, but he said no more, retreating to his chair, alone. Miss Marple opened her notebook, her script precise. Sir Henry, Lydia's fortune, will favouring Evelyn, contested by George. Evelyn's past blank, pre-1923, Clara. Lushall, Evelyn at rocks. Evelyn, photograph, guarded, claims it's Lydia's. Langley suggests sedative poisoning. The letter from London had clarified the stakes, but Evelyn's photograph was a new enigma, its significance unclear. Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, where a hidden letter had exposed a blackmailer's identity. The photograph, she suspected, held a similar key. Standing by her window, the sea a dark expanse under a crescent moon, Miss Marple felt the case's weight. Lydia's murder, staged as a drowning, was a calculated act, its roots in Evelyn's obscured past. The letter from London had lit a path, but the photograph was a shadow, hinting at a deeper truth. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that secrets, however buried, left traces, a glance, a gesture, a hidden image. Here she would follow them, her gentle persistence unraveling the lies until the pattern was complete. Chapter 8. The Tide Turns. The Cliffside Hotel, perched above the restless waves of St. Morwenna's Bay, seemed to hum with a quiet tension, as if the sea itself whispered of secrets yet to be unveiled. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, the morning light filtering through lace curtains, her knitting needles idle in her lap. The past days had woven an intricate web of clues. Clara Vernon's sighting of Evelyn Crane near the rocks, Dr. Langley's revelation of no water in Lydia Ashford's lungs, Sir Henry Clethering's letter detailing the contested will and Evelyn's blank past, and the fleeting glimpse of Evelyn's guarded photograph. Each thread strengthened Miss Marple's conviction that Lydia's death was no accident but a meticulously staged murder with Evelyn at its heart. Yet the why and how remained elusive, like a shadow moving just beyond the light. Today, she resolved to tighten the net, trusting that human nature, as ever, would betray its own deceit. Miss Marple's breakfast was a solitary affair, taken in the dining room where the clink of porcelain was muted by the guests' subdued mood. Her sharp blue eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile, noted the absence of Evelyn Crane, who had not appeared since the garden party the previous day. Mrs. Enid Carstairs, the hotel manager, moved among the tables, her nervous hands adjusting cutlery. With excessive care, her auburn hair pinned so tightly it seemed to mirror her strained composure. Dr. Langley read a medical journal, his brow furrowed, while Clara Vernon, her crimson scarf a vivid splash, sketched at a corner table, her pencil, pausing as if her thoughts wandered. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over Evelyn's photographer memento. She had claimed of Lydia, yet her guarded reaction suggested otherwise. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden locket had once revealed a villager's secret lover. Here, the photograph was a clue she could not yet place. Rising, Miss Marple made her way to the lobby, where a porter handed her a note from Inspector Arthur Tregellis, requesting a meeting at the police station. The summons was not unexpected, given her discreet sharing of Sir Henry's letter and Clara's observation. She donned her black coat and sensible hat, her canvas bag containing her knitting and notebook, and set out along the cliff path to the village. The sea was a restless grey, its waves churning against the rocks below, and the air carried a tang of salt and seaweed. Her steps were slow, her frail appearance belying the agile mind that pieced together the case's fragments. Evelyn's purposeful presence at the rocks, Langley's evidence of a pre-water death, the contested will-all pointed to a calculated crime, but the photograph hinted at a deeper motive. Perhaps a secret Lydia had known and Evelyn had killed. To conceal the police station, a sturdy building near the harbour, smelled of ink and damp wood. Inspector Tregellis greeted her with a nod, his stocky frame filling the small office, his grey eyes keen but guarded. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Your insights have been illuminating." She settled, her knitting bag at her side, her expression bland but attentive. "I'm glad to be of help, Inspector," she said, her tone mild. "Have there been developments?" Tregellis leaned back, his fingers drumming on a file. "Plenty. Dr. Langley's findings. No water in the lung suggest murder, likely by poisoning or sedation. Miss Vernon's statement about Crane at the rocks strengthens the case. And your friend's letter about the will and Crane's past, or lack of it, has us digging deeper." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she drew out her knitting, a pretext for her sharp focus. "Most troubling," she murmured. "Miss Crane's history, or absence thereof, is curious, don't you think?" Triglyce's frown deepened, curious and damning. We've wired London for more on her. No record before 1923, despite her governess claim. And the will George Ashford's, contesting it, says Lydia was coerced. Crane's looking less like a companion and more like a schemer. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice gentle. Scheming, yes, but perhaps more than greed drives her. In my village, a woman's careful lies hid a deeper shame, uncovered by a child's innocent remark. Tregellis studied her, a grudging respect in his gaze. You see things, Miss Marple, that others miss. I'm inclined to bring Crane in for questioning, but I need more something solid. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Small things, Inspector, often tip the scale. A glance, a gesture, a hidden object. He nodded, scribbling a note, and she left, her mind alight with possibilities. Back at the hotel, the lobby buzzed. With quiet activity, Miss Marple paused, observing Mrs. Carstairs, whose nervous hands now clutched a ledger, her eyes darting to the staircase. Evelyn descended, her grey dress impeccable, her smile composed but strained. Miss Marple noted the companion's quick glance round, as if sensing scrutiny, and recalled the photograph's fleeting reveal at the garden party. Determined to probe further, she approached, her tone warm. Miss Crane, a moment. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded, joining her in the lounge. They sat, and Miss Marple drew out her knitting, her questions cloaked in kindly concern. You've borne up so well, she said. Mrs. Ashford's brother, George, did he approve of her? Time here. Evelyn's fingers tightened on her purse. He was. Protective, but distant. They wrote often. Her tone was careful, and Miss Marple shifted tack. And that photograph, you keep such a comfort, I'm sure, of Mrs. Ashford, you said. Evelyn's smile stiffened, her hand covering her purse. Yes, a dear memory. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the lie's thin edge. Their conversation was brief, interrupted by Clara Vernon, who approached with her sketchbook. Miss Marple, I've finished a new piece, she said, her voice eager. Evelyn excused herself, her departure swift, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity to draw Clara out. My dear, your talent is remarkable, she said, studying a sketch. Of the bay, your eye for detail, have you recalled anything more from that day? Clara's face clouded, her voice low. I've been thinking about Evelyn. She was near the rocks, yes, but also, she looked back at Lydia's chair, just before I screamed, as if checking something. Miss Marple's lips pursed, the detail. A vivid stitch in the pattern. In St. Mary Mead, a maid's glance at a window had betrayed her role in a theft. Here, Evelyn's glance suggested intent, perhaps ensuring Lydia was alone or already gone. Miss Marple urged Clara to share this. With Tregellis, her tone reassuring. You've a gift for seeing, my dear. The inspector will value it. Clara nodded, her resolve strengthened, and Miss Marple returned to her room, her notebook open on the desk. She wrote in her precise script, Tregellis murder, likely, poisoning suspected, Evelyn's past blank, will contested. Clara, Evelyn checked Lydia's chair before scream. Evelyn, photograph, lies about it being Lydia's. The tide was turning, the case's shape clearer, but the photograph remained a shadow, its significance elusive. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a hidden diary had revealed a villager's motive for murder. Evelyn's photograph, she suspected, held a similar key. That afternoon, Miss Marple joined the guests for tea on the hotel terrace, the sea a restless backdrop. Evelyn was present, charming a group of locals, but her eyes flicked to Miss Marple, a hint of unease breaking her poise. Dr. Langley approached, his face grave. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking about sedatives," he said, his voice low. "A strong dose morphine, perhaps, could stop breathing without a struggle, explaining the dry lungs." Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild. "A chilling thought, doctor. In my village, a chemist's slip traced a poison to its buyer." Langley's eyes widened, and he promised to share his theory with Trellis. As tea concluded, Miss Marple wandered to the cliff path, her thoughts on Evelyn's photograph. The companion's lie that it was of Lydia suggested a personal stake, perhaps a connection she feared exposing. Returning to the hotel, she found Mrs. Carstairs in the lobby, her hands trembling as she sorted mail. "Mrs. Carstairs," Miss Marple said gently, "you seem troubled. Is all well?" Enid's eyes darted away, her voice unsteady. "Just the strain, Miss Marple. This tragedy." Miss Marple smiled, her tone reassuring, but her mind noted Enid's fear, sensing the manager knew more than she admitted. That evening, a telegram arrived from Tregellis, confirming a breakthrough. Evelyn Crane's identity was a fiction, her name untraceable before 1923, and a London source hinted at a woman matching her description linked to a scandal years prior, though details were vague. Miss Marple read the telegram in her room, the sea's murmur a steady pulse beyond the window. The tide was indeed turning, Evelyn's facade cracking under scrutiny. She recalled St. Mary Mead, where a villager's false identity had unravelled through a parish record. Here, Evelyn's past was the key, and the photograph, she felt, was its lock. Confronting Evelyn directly was risky, but Miss Marple devised a subtle plan. At dinner, she sat near the companion, engaging her in light conversation. "Miss Crane, you've such poise," she said, her voice warm. "Did you train as an actress, perhaps, before becoming a governess?" Evelyn's smile froze, her fork. Pausing, "No, nothing so grand," she said, her tone clipped. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling, and let the moment pass, her probe a seed planted. Evelyn's reaction brief, but telling confirmed a hidden past, one she guarded fiercely. Alone in her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook, adding, "Tregellis, Evelyn's identity, false, possible scandal. Clara, Evelyn checked chair, Langley. Morphine possible. Evelyn, uneasy at actress query, photograph key." The case was coalescing, its outlines sharp, but his heart still veiled. She stood by the window, the sea a dark mirror under the stars, and thought of Lydia. Her life extinguished in a calculated act. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that truth, however buried, left traces a lie, a glance, a hidden image. Here the tide was turning, and she would follow its current, her gentle persistence unravelling Evelyn's web until the truth lay bare. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The cliffside hotel, overlooking the churning waves of St. Morwenna's Bay, seemed to hold its breath as the mystery of Lydia Ashford's death neared a breaking point. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, the morning light casting soft shadows across the lace curtains, her knitting needles resting in her lap. The past days had woven a tight net of evidence. Clara Vernon's sighting of Evelyn, Crane's purposeful movements near the rocks, Dr. Langley's confirmation of no water in Lydia's lungs, Sir Henry Clithering's letter revealing the contested will and Evelyn's untraceable past, and Inspector Tregellis's telegram exposing her false identity. The photograph Evelyn had guarded claimed as a memento of Lydia, But betraying a deeper secret had become the pivot of Miss Marple's suspicions. She felt the case teetering, like a skein of wool about to unravel, and resolved to set a trap. That would force Evelyn's hand, trusting that human nature's inevitable slip would reveal the truth. Breakfast in the dining room was a quiet affair, the guests' faces marked by the strain of recent events. Miss Marple, in her usual corner, sipped tea and nibbled toast, her sharp blue eyes scanning the room behind a demure smile. Mrs. Enid Carstairs, the hotel manager, moved among the tables, her nervous hands adjusting napkins with a jittery precision, her auburn hair pinned so tightly it seemed to mirror her taut nerves. Dr. Langley read a medical journal, his brow furrowed, while Clara Vernon, her crimson scarf vivid against her pale face, sat alone, her sketchbook closed. Evelyn Crane entered. Late, her grey dress impeccable, her poise intact but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. Miss Marple noted her quick glance around, as if sensing the tightening scrutiny, and recalled her strange reaction to the actress' query the previous evening. The companion was on edge, and Miss Marple intended to exploit that vulnerability. Her plan was delicate, rooted in the St. Mary Mead principle that people, when pressed, revealed their secrets through small, unguarded moments. She had devised a scheme to test Evelyn's composure, using Clara's artistic talent as the catalyst. Approaching Clara after breakfast, Miss Marple found her in the lounge, staring at the sea through a window. "My dear," she said, her voice warm, "your sketches are so evocative. Have you ever tried a portrait?" Clara turned, surprised, her fingers twisting her scarf. "Portraits? Not often, but I could. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I was thinking of Mrs. Ashford. A portrait of her, from memory, might be a fitting tribute, perhaps displayed here for the guests to honor her." Clara's face lit with interest, though her eyes clouded. "It would be challenging, but I could try. Her face is still so clear in my mind." Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle but deliberate. "It would mean much, I think, to those who knew her, and it might stir memories details we've overlooked." Clara agreed, promising to start at once, and Miss Marple left her to it, her mind already on the trap's next phase. A portrait, unveiled publicly, would confront Evelyn with Lydia's image, testing her reaction. In St. Mary Mead, a villager's flinch at a lost gloves display had betrayed a theft. Here, Evelyn's response might crack her polished facade, revealing the truth behind her lies. Returning to her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook, her precise script capturing the plan. Clara to paint Lydia's portrait, to be displayed. Evelyn's reaction, key. Tregellis, Evelyn's identity false, scandal hinted. Langley, morphine likely. Photograph, Evelyn's secret, not Lydia's. She paused, her pen hovering, and considered the photograph's significance. It's guarded. Secrecy suggested a personal connection, perhaps a past Evelyn feared exposing. Sir Henry's letter and Treglis's telegram had confirmed her false identity, hinting at a scandal, and Miss Marple suspected the photograph held the key to that hidden life. Her trap, if successful, would push Evelyn to act, exposing her. Motive and method. Mid-morning, Miss Marple sought out Inspector Tregellis, finding him at the police station, his desk cluttered with reports. His stocky frame and keen grey eyes exuded a quiet determination, and he greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple, you're becoming a regular," he said, a trace of amusement in his Cornish accent. "What's on your mind?" She settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side. and spoke with measured calm. "Inspector, I've an idea to test Miss Crane. Miss Vernon is painting a portrait of Mrs. Ashford to be shown to the guests. I believe Miss Crane's reaction could be revealing." Treglis's brow rose, his interest piqued. A clever move. "She's rattled already. Our inquiries into her past are closing in. We've a lead on a woman, Margaret Ellis, tied to a fraud case in 1922, vanished after. Description matches Crane." Miss Marple's lips pursed, the name a new thread. "Margaret Ellis," she murmured. "In my village, a false name once hid a poisoner caught by a shopkeeper's memory." Tregillis leaned forward, his voice low. "If Crane is Ellis, she's got motive beyond the will covering her tracks, maybe. Your portrait idea could push her to slip. I'll have a man at the hotel when it's shown." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Small pressures, Inspector, often break the strongest masks." She left, her mind turning over the name Margaret Ellis. A fraud case suggested cunning. A vanished woman, a desperate reinvention. Evelyn's photograph, she felt, was tied to this past, its secret the heart of her crime. Back at the hotel, Miss Marple found Clara in a quiet corner of the lounge, her easel set up, her brush darting across a canvas. The portrait was taking shape. Lydia's pale face, her eyes shadowed, her shawl loose about her shoulders. "It's her," Clara said, her voice soft. That look she had, so still. Miss Marple studied the painting, noting its uncanny accuracy, and praised Clara's skill. "It's perfect, my dear. When might it be ready?" Clara promised to finish by evening, and Miss Marple arranged with Mrs. Carstairs for a small gathering to unveil it, framing it as a tribute to Lydia. Enid's nervous hands trembled as she agreed, her eyes darting to the staircase, and Miss Marple noted her fear, sensing the manager's knowledge of Evelyn's actions was growing harder to suppress. That afternoon, the hotel buzzed with anticipation, the guests intrigued by the promised unveiling. Miss Marple mingled, her lavender dress unobtrusive, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Evelyn was present, charming a group of locals, but her smile was brittle, her glances frequent toward the lounge where Clara worked. Miss Marple approached. Dr. Langley, who stood by a window, his face grave. "Miss Marple, this portrait business you're doing?" he asked, his voice low. She smiled, her tone mild. "A small gesture, Doctor, to honor Mrs. Ashford, but it may stir things." Langley nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "If it's morphine, as I suspect, Crane had access. Lydia's medicine cabinet was full of sedatives." Miss Marple's lips pursed, the detail aligning with her suspicions. In St. Mary Mead, a doctor's note had traced a sedative to a killer's hand. Here, Evelyn's access was a damning link. As evening fell, the guests gathered in the lounge, the portrait covered by a cloth on an easel. Mrs. Carstairs, her hands shaking, introduced the event, her voice faltering. Clara stood beside the easel, her face pale but resolute, and Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her eyes fixed on Evelyn, who stood near the front, her poise strained. Tregulis's constable, disguised as a waiter, hovered nearby, his presence a quiet reassurance. Clara unveiled the portrait, and a murmur rippled through the room. Lydia's face, rendered with haunting precision, stared out, her eyes resigned, her shawl trailing, a mirror of her final moments. The guests gasped, their voices hushed, but Miss Marple watched Evelyn. The companion's reaction was immediate, though subtle. Her face paled, her hands trembled, and her eyes widened, not with grief, but with a flicker of fear. She stepped back, Her purse clutched tightly, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. The trap had worked. Evelyn was shaken, her mask slipping. In St. Mary Mead, a villager's flinch at a stolen rings display had led to a confession. Here, Evelyn's fear was a signpost to her guilt. Miss Marple leaned toward Triglis's constable, whispering, "Search her room now for the photograph." The constable nodded, slipping away, and Miss Marple resumed her watch, her needles clicking softly. Evelyn recovered quickly, joining the guests in praising Clara's work. But her laughter was forced, her eyes darting to the door. Miss Marple approached her tone kindly. "A striking likeness, Miss Crane. It must bring back memories." Evelyn's smile was tight, her voice unsteady. "It does, Miss Marple, so vivid." Her hand strayed to her purse, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, sensing the photographs. "Wait." The constable returned, his expression neutral, and whispered to Miss Marple that a search was underway. She nodded, her mind racing. The portrait had done its work, but the photograph was the key, its secret the final piece. Later, Triglis arrived, his face grim. He met Miss Marple in the lobby, away from prying ears. "Your trap paid off," he said, his voice low. "We found a locket in Crane's room, hidden in a drawer. Inside, a photograph not of Lydia, but a woman resembling her, with Crane's features. Documents with it point to Margaret Ellis, alias Evelyn Crane. Lydia's estranged cousin, presumed. Dead in 1922 after a fraud scandal." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, the revelation aligning with her suspicions. "A cousin," she murmured. "In my village, a hidden relative, once killed for an inheritance, caught by a parish record." Triglis nodded, his respect evident. "She staged a drowning to assume Lydia's identity, using their likeness and the will. The sedative morphine, we think, was slipped into Lydia's tea, stopping her heart before the water." Miss Marple stood by a window, the sea a restless expanse below. The trap had sprung, revealing Evelyn as Margaret, her motive a twisted bid to reclaim a life and fortune through murder. The photograph, a link to her true self, had been her undoing, its secret exposed by the portrait's pressure. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that truth, however guarded, left tracessa, hidden image, a trembling hand, a moment of fear. Here, the tide had turned fully, and the trap, set with care, had caught its prey, leaving only the final reckoning. Chapter 10. The Confession. The Cliffside Hotel. Its red brick facade, glowing faintly under the moonlight of St. Morwenna's Bay, seemed to exhale a collective sigh as the truth about Lydia Ashford's death emerged from the shadows. Miss Jane Marple sat in the lounge, her small figure tucked into a backed chair, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The events of the previous evening, Clara Vernon's portrait unveiling, Evelyn Crane's trembling reaction, and the discovery of the locket revealing her as Margaret Ellis. Lydia's estranged cousin had shifted the case from suspicion to certainty. The trap Miss Marple had set had sprung, exposing a murder disguised as a drowning, orchestrated by a woman whose false identity hid a desperate bid for fortune and reinvention. Yet, as the sea murmured beyond the windows, Miss Marple knew the final act required a confrontation, a moment where Margaret's facade would crumble under the weight of her own guilt. The morning had dawned crisp, the bay sparkling under a clear sky, but the hotel's atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Miss Marple, having breakfasted early on toast and tea, observed the guests with her sharp blue eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile. Mrs. Enid Carstairs, the manager, was more subdued than usual, her nervous hands stilled as if braced for the inevitable. Dr. Hugh Langley sipped coffee, his medical journal unopened, his face etched with quiet resolve. Clara Vernon, her crimson scarf loosely knotted, sat near the window, her sketchbook idle, her eyes distant. Evelyn, or rather, Margaret Ellis, had not appeared. Reportedly confined to her room under police watch, a fact whispered among the staff. Miss Marple's mind turned over the locket's photograph, the documents naming Margaret, and Inspector Tregellis's confirmation of her past fraud. The pieces were in place, but a confession, she knew, would seal the truth, as it had in St. Mary Mead when a villager's tearful admission had closed a case of theft. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a note from Tregillis, delivered by a porter. It requested her presence at the police station for a final interview with Margaret, scheduled for noon. She folded the note, her expression bland but her mind alert. The confrontation would be delicate, requiring the gentle pressure she had honed over years of unraveling village secrets. In St. Mary Mead, a soft question had once drawn a murderous confession, sparked by a misplaced brooch. Here, Margaret's guilt, already exposed by the locket, needed only a nudge to spill forth. Miss Marple donned her black coat and sensible hat, her canvas bag containing her knitting and notebook, and set out for the village, the cliff path bright with gorse and wildflowers. The police station, nestled near the harbour where fishing boats bobbed, was a hive of quiet activity. Tregillis greeted her with a nod, his stocky frame filling the office doorway, his grey eyes sharp with determination. "Miss Marple, your trap worked a treat," he said, his Cornish accent softened by respect. "Margaret Ellis is in the interview. Room rattled but stubborn. I'd value your presence, she might crack under your way of seeing things." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I'm glad to assist, Inspector. People, you know, often say more than they intend when they're uneasy." Tregillis chuckled, leading her to a small room where Margaret sat, her grey dress creased, her dark hair slightly dishevelled, her poise fraying at the edges. Margaret looked up as they entered, her eyes narrowing, though a flicker of fear betrayed. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, her expression kindly but unwavering. Tregillis stood, his notebook open, and began, his tone firm but measured. "Miss Ellis, or should I say Mrs. Ashford's cousin Weave, evidence you're not Evelyn Crane, a locket with your photograph, documents from 1922, a fraud scandal you fled. You poisoned Lydia with morphine, staged her drowning to claim her identity and fortune. Care to explain?" Margaret's hands clenched, her face pale, but she lifted her chin. "You're mistaken, Inspector. I was her companion, nothing more. The locket's just a keepsake." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the tremor in her fingers, a sign of strain. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft as a village gossip's. "My dear, it's hard to carry such a secret, isn't it? The photograph, own face, so like Lydia's. You were family, yet estranged. Why hide that bond?" Margaret's eyes widened, her composure slipping, and Miss Marple pressed gently, her tone sympathetic. "In my village, a woman once hid her past, but a letter betrayed her. Your locket, I think, tells a similar story." Margaret's lips parted, but no words came, and Tregillis seized the moment, his voice sharper. "Weave the morphine bottle. Miss Ellis, from Lydia's room, your fingerprints on it. The post-mortem confirms poisoning, not drowning. You checked her chair, as Miss Vernon saw, to ensure she was dead before the water. Margaret's facade cracked, her hands trembling violently. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice raw. Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles clicking softly, a soothing counterpoint to the tension. "Help us understand, my dear," she said, her eyes steady. "Lydia trusted you, yet you took her life. Was it only the money?" Margaret's gaze dropped, her shoulders sagging, and the room seemed to hold its breath. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice low and bitter. "It wasn't just money. Lydia, she had everything: wealth, status, a name. I had nothing, cast out after the scandal, presumed dead. We were cousins, but she turned her back on me, let me rot." Miss Marple listened, her mind cataloguing the confession's bitter edge. So, like a St. Mary Mead widow's rant against a rival which had led to a poisoning, Margaret continued, her words tumbling now. "I found her 2 years ago, answered her advertisement as Evelyn Crane. I saw my chance to take her place, to live her life. Our resemblance was my weapon. I changed her will, slowly, with flattery and care. Then, here, I used morphine from her own supply in her tea. She didn't struggle, just slipped away. I carried her to the shallows, made it look like a drowning. I thought no one would question it." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Her sobs ragged but genuine. Tregulus scribbled furiously, his face grim, while Miss Marple sat back, her needles still, her expression one of quiet sorrow. Margaret's confession, though shocking, was not unexpected. It mirrored the human frailties she had seen in St. Mary Mead, where greed and resentment twisted even familial bonds. "You planned to become Lydia," Miss Marple said softly, "to withdraw her fortune gradually, unseen." Margaret nodded, her face ashen. "I was so close. The portrait. It was her eyes, staring at me, accusing. I couldn't bear it." Miss Marple's lips pursed, the portrait's role in breaking Margaret confirmed, a tactic as effective as a St. Mary Mead sermon that had once shamed a thief into confessing. Tregulus signalled to a constable, who entered to escort Margaret to a cell. "You'll face charges, Miss Ellis," he said, his tone final. "Murder, fraud, identity theft." Margaret rose, her poise shattered, her eyes hollow, as she passed. "Miss Marple," she paused, her voice a whisper. "You saw too much, old woman." Miss Marple met her gaze, her expression mild but unflinching. "People, my dear, always show more than they mean to." Margaret was led away, and the room fell. Silent, the sea's murmur a distant echo through the window. Tregulus turned to Miss Marple, his respect unmasked. "You've a gift, Miss Marple. That portrait, your questions, they broke her, where we might have faltered." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "In my village, Inspector, small thinks a word, a look often opened the widest doors." He nodded, offering to escort her back to the hotel, but she declined, preferring the cliff path's solitude to reflect. The confession had closed the case, but its human cost Lydia's life. Margaret's ruin weighed on her, as had every tragedy in St. Mary Mead. Returning to the hotel, Miss Marple found the lounge abuzz with news of Margaret's arrest. The guests' faces a mix of shock and relief. Mrs. Carstairs approached, her hands steadier now, her voice tremulous. "Is it true, Miss Marple, Miss Crane? A murderer?" Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle. She was not Miss Crane, Mrs. Carstairs, but a woman lost to her own resentment. "It's over now." Enid's eyes filled, and Miss Marple suspected. The manager's nerves had stemmed from glimpses of Margaret's true nature, unspoken until now. Dr. Langley joined them, his face somber. "I heard, Miss Marple, morphing, as I thought. You saw it all, didn't you?" She smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "I saw what people showed," Dr. agreed, "like fear is careless in its tracks." Langley nodded, and Clara Vernon approached, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. "The portrait did it," she said, her voice awed. "I never thought." Miss Marple patted her hand, her tone warm. "Your art, my dear, spoke louder than words. You've a rare gift." Clara blushed, and Miss Marple felt a quiet pride, as she had in St. Mary Mead when a young girl's testimony had solved a theft. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea on the terrace, the sea a serene blue below. The guests, freed from the mystery shadow, laughed more freely, their voices mingling with the gulls' cries. She opened her notebook, her script precise. Margaret Ellis confessed. Lydia's cousin used morphine, staged drowning to assume identity, driven by resentment and greed. Portrait broke her. Case closed. She closed the book, her mind turning to St. Mary Mead, where each case had taught her the fragility of human bonds. Lydia's trust, Margaret's betrayal, mirrored countless stories, their endings written in the choices people made. As evening fell, Miss Marple stood by her window, the sea a dark mirror under the stars. The confession had laid bare a tragedy of envy and loss, its roots in a past Margaret could not escape. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that truth, however bitter, brought clarity, like sunlight after a storm. Here, the confession had done the same, and she felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered by sorrow for the lives broken. Her needles clicked softly. A new row begun, and she trusted that St. Morwena's Bay, like her village, would heal its secrets now at rest. Chapter 11. The departure of the Cliffside Hotel. Its windows glinting in the late morning sun of St. Morwena's Bay seemed to shed the weight of recent days, as if the confession of Margaret Ellis had cleansed the air of its lingering unease. Miss Jane Marple, her small figure wrapped in a light shawl, stood in her room, packing her modest suitcase with the care of one accustomed to orderly departures. The mystery of Lydia Ashford's murder unravelled through Clara Vernon's pivotal observation, Dr. Langley's medical insight, Sir Henry Clithering's crucial letter, and the damning locket had culminated in Margaret's raw confession, exposing her as Lydia's envious cousin who poisoned her to steal her identity and fortune. As Miss Marple folded her knitting into her canvas bag, her sharp blue eyes, softened by a reflective calm, gazed at the sea, its waves a serene counterpoint to the human storm now quieted. Yet her mind, ever active, sifted through the case's lessons, knowing that human nature, like the tide, was never fully at rest. The hotel buzzed with a tentative return to normalcy, the guests' voices brighter as they gathered in the dining room for breakfast. Miss Marple joined them, her lavender dress unobtrusive, her presence almost overlooked amid the chatter. She chose a table by the window, her tea and toast a simple fare, and observed her fellow guests with the quiet acuity that had served her so well. Mrs. Enid Carstairs, the manager, moved with a newfound steadiness, her auburn hair less rigidly pinned, her hands calm as she directed the staff. The nervous flutter that had marked her days was gone, replaced by a relief Miss Marple attributed to the truth's emergence, which had likely eased Enid's unspoken fears about Margaret's behaviour. Dr. Hugh Langley, his medical journal now read with focus, exchanged pleasantries with a local merchant, his face unburdened. Clara Vernon, her crimson scarf loosely draped, sketched at a nearby table, her strokes confident, her haunted look faded. The absence of Margaret Ellis, now in custody awaiting trial, was a silent presence, felt but not mourned. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts on the guests' transformations. In St. Mary Mead, the resolution of a mysterious stolen heirloom or a hushed scandal of them restored the village's rhythm, its people quick to resume their routines, yet subtly changed. Here the hotel mirrored that pattern, its community, knitting itself back together, the scar of murder softened by justice. She recalled Margaret's bitter words in the confession, her resentment of Lydia's wealth and status, and saw in them the echo of countless St. Mary Mead dramas where envy or betrayal had sparked small crimes, though rarely so deadly. The case, she mused, was a reminder that greed, like a weed, could choke even the closest bonds. As breakfast ended, Clara approached, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, a shy smile on her lips. "Miss Marple, I heard you were leaving today," she said, her voice warm. "I wanted to thank you. Your encouragement, the portrait made all the difference." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her smile kind. "My dear, your keen eye and brave heart did the work. That portrait was a mirror to the truth." Clara blushed, then offered a small gifter sketch of the bay, its cliffs and waves captured in delicate lines. "For you to remember us," she said. Miss Marple accepted it with a nod, her fingers tracing the paper. "A lovely memento, Clara. You've a rare gift, and I trust you'll use it well." The exchange, simple yet heartfelt, reminded her of St. Mary Mead, where a young seamstress's gratitude had cemented a bond after a solved theft. Dr. Langley joined them, his weathered face softened by a smile. "Miss Marple, you've left your mark on us," he said, his tone earnest. "I'd have missed the morphine's role without your nudging. You're a marvel." She inclined her head, her expression modest. "Nonsense, doctor. You saw the signs. I merely listened. In my village, a chemist's clue once pointed the way, much as your expertise did here." Langley chuckled, shaking his head. "You've a way of seeing the world, Miss Marple. Safe travels, and don't let Cornwall forget you." His words, warm and genuine, stirred a quiet pride in her, tempered by the humility that kept her grounded. Mrs. Carstairs approached. Next, her relief palpable. "Miss Marple, we owe you so much," she said, her voice steady but emotional. I suspected something was wrong with Miss Crane Margaret, but I couldn't speak. You saw it all." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her tone reassuring. "You did your part, Mrs. Carstairs, keeping the hotel steady through it all. Fear can silence us, but truth finds a way." Enid's eyes glistened, and Miss Marple suspected the manager's nerves had stemmed from glimpsing Margaret's cold ambition, a burden now lifted. The moment echoed St. Mary Mead, where a shopkeeper's unspoken doubts had aided a case once voiced. The morning progressed, and Miss Marple returned to her room to complete her packing. Her suitcase, neatly arranged with her shawl, books, and knitting, was a testament to her orderly life, yet her mind lingered on the disorder of human motives. Margaret's confession had laid bare a tragedy of envy and reinvention. Her plan to assume Lydia's identity, a chilling blend of cunning and desperation. The locket's photograph, revealing Margaret's true face, had been the key, its discovery. Sparked by the portrait's pressure, Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, where a hidden letter had exposed a blackmailer's scheme, and saw in this case the same truth. Secrets, however buried, left traces for those who looked. A knock at the door heralded Inspector Arthur Tregillis, his stocky frame filling the doorway, his grey eyes warm with admiration. "Miss Marple, I couldn't let you leave without a word," he said, his Cornish accent rich. "Your trap, the portrait, your questions it, broke the case wide open. Margaret's confessed fully, and we've evidence enough for a conviction." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, her expression bland but attentive. "I'm glad, Inspector. You've done fine work, tying the threads together." Tregillis shook his head, a wry smile on his lips. "You tied them, Miss Marple?" "I was skeptical at first, but you see what we missed, those small things, glances, lies. I'll not forget it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a soothing rhythm. "In my village, Inspector, small things often speak loudest. A misplaced key, a hesitant word, they point the way." Tregillis nodded, his respect unmasked. "You've taught me that. If you're ever back in Cornwall, we'll need your eyes." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I trust St. Morwenna's Bay will be kinder next time." He left, promising to send word of the trial, and Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, as she had in St. Mary Mead, when a constable's gratitude had sealed a case's end. With her packing complete, Miss Marple took a final walk along the cliff path, the sea a shimmering expanse below. The bay, once a stage for murder, now seemed at peace, its beauty untainted by the tragedy it had witnessed. She paused, her shawl fluttering in the breeze, and reflected on the cases human told Lydia's trust betrayed, Margaret's life undone by her own choices. In St. Mary Mead, each mystery had taught her the fragility of human bonds, the ease with which envy or greed could fracture them. Here the lesson was the same, though the scale was grander, the stakes more deadly. Returning to the hotel, Miss Marple found the lobby bustling with departing guests, their suitcases piled by the door. A porter carried her own case to the waiting car, and she bid farewell to the staff, their faces warm with gratitude. Mrs. Carstairs clasped her hand, her voice soft. "You've given us back our peace, Miss Marple." "Thank you," Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle. "Peace is a gift we all share, Mrs. Carstairs. Keep it well." The manager's eyes glistened, and Miss Marple moved on, her heart light but mindful of the sorrow beneath the resolution. The car wound along the cliffs to the station, the countryside a patchwork of green and gold. Miss Marple boarded the train, her compartment cosy, her canvas bag at her side. As the whistle blew and the train chugged forward, she opened Clara's sketch, its lines capturing the bay's wild beauty. It was a fitting memento, a reminder of a case solved through patience and perception. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where each mystery had honed her understanding of human nature, and saw in St. Morwenna's Bay a mirror of that truth people. Wherever they were, left clues in their actions, their silences, their choices. Settling back, Miss Marple drew out her knitting, her needles resuming their rhythm. The train rattled through Cornwall's fields, carrying her toward home. But her mind was already open to the next puzzle life might present. In St. Mary Mead, a new gossip or oddity often sparked her curiosity. Here, the memory of Margaret's confession, Lydia's lost life, and the bay's deceptive calm would linger, a chapter closed but never forgotten. She smiled faintly, her eyes on the passing landscape, and trusted that wherever she went, human nature would offer its secrets, waiting for her gentle touch to unravel them. Chapter 12. A quiet reflection the train from St. Morwenna's Bay had carried Miss Jane Marple back to the familiar embrace of St. Mary Mead, where the village's gentle rhythms welcomed her like an old friend. It was a bright June afternoon. In 1925, the air sweet with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. As she sat in the parlour of her modest cottage, a tray of tea and scones before her. The room was a haven of quiet order, chintz curtains framing the windows, a bookshelf lined with novels and gardening manuals, and her knitting basket tucked beside an armchair. Her sharp blue eyes, softened by the comfort of home, gazed at the garden where bees hummed among the lavender. Yet her mind, ever restless, lingered on the events of St. Morwenna's Bay, sifting through the tragedy of Lydia Ashford's murder and the unmasking of Margaret Ellis, whose envious heart had woven a deadly deception. As she poured tea, Miss Marple felt the weight of the case settle into memory, a lesson in human frailty to be pondered in the stillness of her village. Her friend Dolly Bantry, wife of Colonel Arthur Bantry, arrived promptly at 3, her cheerful bustle a contrast to Miss Marple's serene calm. Dolly, in a floral dress and a wide-brimmed hat, sank into a chair with a contented sigh, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Jane, you must tell me everything," she said, reaching for a scone. St. Morwenna's Bay sounds positively murder at a seaside hotel. Arthur says you've outdone yourself, solving it like one of those detectives in his novels. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly as she drew out her knitting, her tone modest but warm. "Nonsense, Dolly. I merely watched and listened, as I do here. People, you know, are much the same, whether in Cornwall or St. Mary Mead." Dolly leaned forward, her voice eager. But a cousin posing as a companion, poisoning her own kin for a fortune it's straight out of a melodrama. "Start at the beginning, Jane, and don't spare a detail." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes twinkling, and began, her voice a gentle thread weaving the tale. She spoke of the cliffside hotel, its grand Victorian charm perched above the bay, and her arrival as a guest seeking rest, only to find a mystery unfolding. Lydia Ashford was a widow, wealthy but withdrawn, she said, always with her companion, Evelyn Crane, who seemed devoted but too polished, like a mirror reflecting what others wished to see. Dolly shivered, spreading jam on her scone. "I'd have trusted her, Jane." "How did you know?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression reflective. "Small things, Dolly." Her smile was too perfect, her grief on the beach too dry. In St. Mary Mead, a maid's practiced tears once hid a theft, caught by a smudge of ink on her hand. Evelyn Margaret, as we learned, had that same careful air. She recounted the morning of the tragedy, when Clara Vernon's scream had drawn attention to Lydia's body in the shallows, Dr. Langley's futile efforts to revive her, and the initial verdict of accidental drowning. But Dr. Langley noticed no water in her lungs, she said, and Clara saw Margaret near the rocks, moving with purpose, not idly wandering as she claimed. Dolly's eyes widened, her scone forgotten. No water, then it wasn't a drowning. "At all," Miss Marple nodded, her voice steady. "A murder, staged to deceive. I spoke with the vicar, Mr. Penrose, who knew Lydia's wealth and her brother in London, and saw Margaret posting letters, official ones, which hinted at a hidden agenda. She described her letter to Sir Henry Clithering, whose reply confirmed the will's change favouring Margaret and her untraceable past, and Inspector Tregellis's telegram revealing her as Margaret Ellis, Lydia's cousin, vanished after a fraud scandal. Each clue was a stitch, she said, and Clara's portrait of Lydia, unveiled to unsettle Margaret, was the needle that pulled them together. Dolly clapped her hands, her voice awed. That portrait genius, Jane. You set a trap, didn't you? Miss Marple's smile was faint, her needles resuming their rhythm. A gentle one, Dolly. Margaret's fear at seeing Lydia's face, so like her own, betrayed her. The police found a locket in her room with her photograph, not Lydia's, and papers naming her as Margaret Ellis. She confessed morphine in Lydia's tea, a plan to assume her identity, driven by years of resentment. Dolly shivered again, her tea cooling. Her own cousin, how could she? Miss Marple's eyes softened, her tone thoughtful. Envy is a poison, Dolly, as deadly as morphine. Margaret saw Lydia's life wealth, status and wanted it, believing it her due. In St. Mary Mead, a gardener's grudge against a rival led to sabotage, though thankfully not murder. The parlour grew quiet, the ticking of the mantel clock a soft counterpoint to Miss Marple's words. She poured more tea, her mind drifting to the hotel's final days, the guests' relief, Clara's gifted sketch, Dr. Langley's gratitude, and Tregellis's newfound respect. The village healed, as ours does, she said, but the scar remains, a reminder of trust betrayed. Dolly nodded, her expression somber. You see it all, Jane, the little things, the glances. Arthur says you're sharper than Scotland Yard, and I believe him. Miss Marple chuckled, her needles clicking. Arthur flatters, Dolly. I only notice what people show, often without meaning to. A glance, a gesture, a lie they're like. Weeds in a garden, easy to spot if you know the soil. Dolly leaned back, her curiosity unquenched. But how did you stay so calm, Jane, with a murderer in the hotel? Weren't you afraid? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her voice gentle. Fear comes, Dolly, but understanding calms it. Margaret was dangerous, but human, and humans err. In St. Mary Mead, a poacher's threat once frightened the village, until his clumsy lies revealed a frightened boy beneath. Margaret's lies were her weakness, and I trusted they'd undo her. Dolly shook her head, marveling. You're a wonder, Jane. What now? Back to your roses and knitting, or off to another mystery? Miss Marple smiled, setting her knitting aside. For now, St. Mary Mead is enough. The roses need tending, and the village has its own small dramaser, missing cat, a feud over the church bazaar. They keep me sharp. She rose, inviting Dolly to the garden, where the lavender swayed in the breeze. As they walked, Miss Marple pointed out a new rose bush, its buds promising blooms. Life goes on, Dolly, even after tragedy. St. Morwena's Bay taught me that, as our village does. Dolly nodded, her arm linked with Miss Marple's, and they strolled in companionable silence, the village humming around them, back in the parlour. Miss Marple opened her notebook, its pages filled with the case's details, and added a final entry in her precise script. Margaret Ellis's confession closed a chapter of envy and loss. St. Mary Mead welcomes me home. Its quiet, a mirror to the bay's healing. Human nature, here or there, speaks in small truths. She closed the book, her thoughts on the sketch Clara had given her. Now framed on the mantel a delicate rendering of the bay's cliffs, a memento of a case solved through patience and perception. In St. Mary Mead, each mystery had sharpened her lens on the world, and St. Morwena's Bay had added a new facet. Its lesson one of trust's fragility and truth's persistence. As Dolly prepared to leave, she paused at the door, her hat tilted jauntily. You'll tell me if another adventure calls, Won't you, Jane? I live for your stories. Miss Marple's smile was warm, her eyes bright. If the world offers another puzzle, Dolly, you'll hear of it. But for now, the village is my story, and it's enough. Dolly laughed, stepping into the lane, and Miss Marple watched her go. The village's familiar outlines a comfort after the bay's wild beauty. Alone, Miss Marple stood by the window, the garden a tapestry of colour in the fading light. The case had been a journey, its twists and turns a test of her quiet skill. Margaret's envy, Lydia's betrayal, the hotel's uneasy dance of secrets all echoed the dramas of St. Mary Mead, where human hearts, however small the stage, played out their joys and sorrows. She thought of the locket. It photographed the key to Margaret's past, and saw in it a mirror to countless village clues, a hidden note, a whispered rumour, a fleeting glance. Truth, she knew, was a patient hunter, waiting for those who watched, sitting. Once more, Miss Marple drew out her knitting, her needles resuming their rhythm. The village outside hummed with life children playing, a dog barking. The distant chime of the church bell, St. Mary Mead was her anchor, its simplicity a canvas for the complexities she unravelled. St. Morwenna's Bay had been a chapter, vivid and dark, but this parlour, this moment, was home. She smiled faintly, her mind open to the next whisper of trouble, trusting that human nature, wherever she found it, would offer its secrets, waiting for her gentle touch to bring them to light.